They said America was shining, gold in the banks, steel in the sky, carriages clattering over polished avenues. But the first sign of danger was not loud, it was a sweetness in the water. A cough behind a velvet curtain, a faint tremor in a child's hands as gas lamps flickered along streets too crowded to breathe. While fortunes rose like monuments, something unseen prowled the alleys and parlors alike, drifting under doors and settling in lungs with the softness of falling ash. The nation celebrated its progress, unaware that its greatest killers were already inside. Cholera did not knock, it burst in like a thief. Smallpox wore the disguise of ordinary fever until the blotches bloomed like cursed flowers across the skin. Typhoid seeped through polished silver pitchers, poisoning families who believed themselves untouchable. Tuberculosis floated through the air like a pale ghost, lingering in boarding houses, factories, and the glittering mansions of Fifth Avenue. The Gilded Age sparkled, but beneath the gold, America pulsed with dread, an empire of wealth balanced on a foundation of disease. And as you move through these stories, stories of doctors who trembled, cities that choked, and epidemics that rewrote the nation's future, stay with me. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these forgotten shadows burning in the lamplight. Now step closer. The air is still. The lamps hum. This is how the plagues came, and why they never truly left. It began, as so many calamities do, with something so small that no one thought to fear it. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window of the Waverly boarding house, catching the dust motes as they drifted like pale embers above the table. Mrs. Halcombe, who prided herself on maintaining an establishment of modest respectability, lifted the crystal pitcher from its place and paused. The water glimmered with unusual brilliance, as though a faint syrupy sheen clung to the surface. She tilted it gently. The liquid swayed with a thickness that did not belong to it. A single drop slid down the side, leaving behind the memory of sweetness on the glass. Yet no scent betrayed anything amiss, no cloudiness, no discoloration, only a subtle sweetness so delicate that one might mistake it for imagination, or for the remnants of last night's lemonade. Morning rushed upon her with its usual demands, and there were tenants to be fed, linens to be washed, and young Mr. Delaney upstairs coughing into his handkerchief again. So she poured the water into cups and thought no more of it. The boarders drifted into the dining room with their customary weariness, laborers with stiff shoulders, a seamstress rubbing her swollen knuckles, a telegraph operator blinking away the fog of too little sleep. They drank without hesitation. The pitcher emptied quickly. No grimace crossed any face, only a faint lifting of brows, as though each person tasted something slightly unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Sweetness, after all, was hardly a warning. Yet as the day unfolded, the quiet rhythm of the house began to warp. Young Mr. Delaney descended the staircase, gripping the railing as though the world tilted beneath him. Beads of cold perspiration speckled his brow. He muttered that his legs felt hollow, as though someone had scooped the strength from his bones. Mrs. Halcombe led him to a chair, pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, and assured the others it was merely the summer heat. But as she watched him shiver despite the warm air, an unease crept beneath her corset, tight, breathless, unignorable. By noon, the seamstress, Miss Granger, a woman who rarely missed a day's work no matter the state of her health, collapsed beside her sewing machine. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when Mrs. Halcombe lifted her head, the poor girl whispered that her stomach churned with the force of waves crashing upon stone. The workers who carried her to her room grew pale themselves, alarmed by the way her pulse flickered beneath her skin like a candle struggling for air. Still, no one spoke of contagion. Such words carried weight, dangerous weight, in a city where rumors traveled faster than streetcars. Illness could empty a boarding house, ruin reputations, summon health inspectors who wielded authority like blades. And so Mrs. Halcombe pressed her lips together and simply said, Miss Granger would need rest. Rest and perhaps some cool water. But when she reached for the pitcher, she froze. The glass was not clean. A faint residue, sticky, glistening, and wholly unnatural, clung to the inside, catching the dim afternoon light like sugar melting on a stove. She touched it with the edge of her fingertip. It stretched, thin and reluctant, before pulling back into itself. A shiver threaded through her. Outside, the street bustled with carriages and hurried footsteps. Vendors called out their wares, children darted between lampposts, and the city breathed in its usual restless rhythm. But here, in the quiet of the boarding-house kitchen, the air shifted, thickened, darkened in ways that words could not yet capture. Mrs. Halcombe lifted the pitcher again. The residue clung more tightly this time. Sweetness. A sweetness that did not belong to water drawn from the public pump. She remembered then the odd sound the pump had made the day before, a hollow gulp, as though swallowing something it ought not to. She had dismissed it, as one dismisses so many small and harmless things in a bustling city. But now, as she stood in the shadowed stillness of her kitchen with sickness blooming upstairs, her heart thudded with a growing and dreadful certainty. Something had entered the water, and it had already entered her home. The parlor of the Waverly boarding house was rarely a place of drama. It was where tenants gathered in the evenings to read the newspapers, write timid letters home, and rest themselves after long hours spent in factories, offices, and dimly lit shops. The wallpaper, rose-patterned though faded, softened the room's edges, and the velvet curtains, once a deep burgundy, now hung in dusky folds that trapped the faint scent of old perfume and lamp oil. It was a place meant for quiet comforts. Yet on this particular evening, comfort had abandoned it entirely. The cough came first, sharp, sudden, startling enough to still every conversation. It cut through the parlor with the clarity of a snapped violin string. All eyes turned toward the far corner, where Mrs. Waverly reclined in her preferred chair, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the warm air. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly. At 81 years old, Mrs. Waverly had outlived 2 husbands, 3 children, and the better part of the century itself. She carried herself with the rigid dignity of a woman accustomed to being obeyed, admired, and cautiously avoided. Yet tonight, she seemed smaller, reduced somehow, as though the shadows pressing in from the velvet curtains sought to claim her inch by inch. Her cough echoed again, soft at first, then deeper, reaching into the hollow of her chest. A sound that did not belong in polite society, wet and rasping, tinged with a note of desperation. When she lifted her handkerchief, a faint stain marked the lace, not bright red, but something darker, something older. A low murmur rippled through the room. Mr. Delaney, still pale from his earlier collapse, rose shakily from his seat. "Madam," he ventured, "perhaps you should retire to your room. You seem unwell." Mrs. Waverly lifted her chin with the last measure of her once formidable pride. "Nonsense," she said, though her voice was hoarse. "It is merely a tickle. The summer dust, no doubt." But no summer dust produced a cough like that. Mrs. Halcombe hovered near the doorway, torn between the obligations of duty and the dread coiling inside her. The sweetness in the pitcher still lingered on her fingertips, like a ghost she could not wash away. 2 tenants already bedridden, and now this. Her gaze followed the fine tremor in Mrs. Waverly's shoulders, the way her breath hitched, the faint sheen of perspiration at her temples. She had seen sickness before, of course. Everyone had. In a city where people lived pressed together like pages in a book, illness wound through communities with the ease of thread slipping through a needle. But this felt different, swifter, hungrier. The lamps flickered, wind moaned along the eaves. Somewhere upstairs, Miss Granger cried out in feverish delirium, and the sound drifted down the staircase like a warning. Mrs. Waverly's cough erupted again, violent, enough to bend her double. Her rings clinked together as she grasped the arm of her chair. Her shawl slipped loose, revealing the startling thinness of her collarbone. Her lungs rattled like a kettle left too long on the boil. A silence followed, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Halcombe stepped forward at last. "Mrs. Waverly," she said gently, "let me help you upstairs." But the old woman shook her head. Her eyes, pale and glassy, held a strange resolve. "No," she whispered, "not yet. I have seen this sort of thing before." The room leaned closer, breathless. "In the cholera year," Mrs. Waverly continued, her voice barely audible, "when the water turned strange, when the air tasted sweet, when people fell ill without warning." Her gaze swept the room, landing on the empty pitcher still resting by the hearth. This feels the same." A chill swept through the parlor, dimming the lamplight as though the house itself recoiled at her words. Then, with a soft sigh, Mrs. Waverley's strength gave way. Her eyes fluttered closed, her head tilting back against the velvet chair. For a moment, one terrible moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Delaney rushed forward, calling her name. Mrs. Halcombe pressed trembling fingers to the old woman's wrist, and in that harrowing quiet, the truth settled over them like dust. The sickness had not remained upstairs. It had slipped behind the velvet curtain, and it was spreading. The tenement on Broome Street had always breathed like a living thing, its walls groaning in winter, its floors creaking beneath the weight of too many footsteps, its stairwells exhaling the mingled scents of coal smoke, cabbage, soap, sweat, and dreams worn thin. Families lived stacked one upon another, each door separating only a sliver of privacy from the constant hum of the building. Children darted through hallways as narrow as alleys, mothers cooked over stoves that hissed with temperamental flames, and the men returned each evening with soot on their faces and exhaustion pressed deep into their bones. But on this gray morning, the building exhaled something else entirely. Something warm, something wrong. The fog began in the lowest corridor, thin at first, barely more than a shimmer on the air. The residents thought it steam from the laundry pots or perhaps condensation from the night's humidity. But this fog did not dissipate. Instead, it curled along the floorboards, finding its way beneath doorframes and up stairwells, creeping with deliberate, almost intelligent slowness. It carried with it the scent of stale sweetness, a scent that refused to be named. Mrs. Kavanaugh noticed it first. She stood at her wash basin, wringing out a shirt belonging to her youngest son, when she felt the room tilt ever so slightly. The walls wavered, the edges of her vision softened. A bead of sweat slid down her spine despite the cool morning air. She pressed a hand to her forehead and whispered, "Not again," though she could not have said what memory those words answered. Her son, Patrick, sat on the floor beside her, playing with a wooden horse. He hummed to himself, oblivious to the tremor in his mother's voice. But when he lifted his head, the fog brushed his cheek, and he paused. His small fingers touched the air as though feeling for something invisible. "Mama," he said softly, "it's warm." She knelt to touch his forehead, fearing fever, but his skin was cool. No, the warmth came from the air itself, as though the fog carried breath. Down the hall, cries erupted from the O'Shea's room. Their eldest daughter, Maeve, had begun vomiting without warning, her body convulsing with a violence that frightened even her strong-willed father. The neighbors gathered in the hallway as Mr. O'Shea carried her outside, her arms dangling limp, her lips pale as candle wax. "Something's in the building," he rasped. "Something's spreading." The words skittered across every spine. Above them, on the third floor, an elderly tailor named Mr. Reuben coughed so harshly that a streak of blood stained his apron. He stumbled to his window, threw it open, and gasped at the air drifting into his room. A sweet, heavy scent that made his lungs seize. He tried to shout to the street below, but his voice collapsed into silence. Next door, 2 infants began wailing at once. A pounding of footsteps thundered down the stairs as men rushed to the front door, flinging it open in a frantic attempt to air out the building. But the fog clung stubbornly, thickening with every passing minute. It had settled into the tenement the way dampness settled into old wood, quiet, unquestioned, relentless. The residents whispered of contaminated wells, of spoiled milk deliveries, of curses and cholera and memories their parents had tried to bury. Fear stitched them together in a single shared pulse that quickened, panicked, desperate. When the first man collapsed in the stairwell, falling forward as though tripped by an unseen hand, the others gathered around him. His face was gray, his breath shallow, his pulse faint and fluttering. The fog curled around his body like a blanket. Mrs. Kavanaugh clutched Patrick to her chest. "We must get out," she whispered. "Open every window. Break them if you must." But when she reached her own window and tried to lift the sash, it stuck. Swollen from summer humidity. Trapped. She pushed harder. The pain groaned. Her breath fogged the glass. Outside, life continued unknowing. Horses clopping by, vendors calling out their wares, children chasing each other through puddles. The city breathed freely while the tenement suffocated. Inside, the fog shimmered with unnatural warmth. Patrick tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, the air tastes sweet." And for the first time, she tasted it too. Not sweetness, not really. Decay disguised as sugar. Something had settled into the tenement, soft as fog, sweet as death, and it was not finished. Dr. Nathaniel Avery had long been known in the city as a man of reliable calm, a physician whose presence steadied rooms where panic threatened to overflow. He was tall, soft-spoken, and habitually dressed in black wool that absorbed the lamplight, as though it, too, understood the gravity of his profession. But what people noticed most were the two bags he carried everywhere he went. One was the familiar leather satchel of a doctor, instruments polished to a shine, bottles of tinctures, packets of powders carefully labeled in his own precise handwriting, remedies, or at least the closest approximations of hope that medicine could offer. The other bag, a narrower, heavier case of dark mahogany, was never opened in public. Some said it held surgical tools sharper than any physician should need. Others whispered it contained documentation for the Board of Health, ready to be used the moment a household crossed the line between the curable and the condemned. But those who watched him closely, especially during the worst years of past epidemics, knew the truth. The second bag was for the dead. On this particular morning, as Dr. Avery's carriage rolled through Broome Street, he smelled the sickness before he saw it. A sweetness on the air, too gentle to be perfume, too persistent to be anything innocent, hung like a veil over the tenement district. He stiffened. His driver glanced back nervously, but the doctor said nothing. He simply lifted his gloved hand to his face and breathed through the thin linen, as though the gesture alone could keep fate at bay. The moment he stepped inside the tenement, heat pressed against him like an unwelcome host. The hallways pulsed with feverish breaths and muffled cries. Fog, thin but unmistakably warm, drifted along the baseboards. Mothers with wild eyes gripped their children tightly. Men stood helplessly by as their neighbors collapsed in stairwells and doorways. Dr. Avery set down his medical satchel and knelt beside the man who had fallen near the entryway. The patient's pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips, fragile as moth wings. His skin was slick with perspiration, yet cold enough that death already seemed to be reaching for him. "How long has he been like this?" the doctor asked. "A few minutes," someone whispered. "He was fine this morning, talking, laughing. Then he just fell." The doctor nodded faintly, though dread coiled inside him. He had seen such rapid declines only twice before. Once during the last cholera season, and again in the year, smallpox stalked the river districts with a hunger that defied understanding. But the scent filling the tenement, the sickly, cloying sweetness, did not belong to either disease. This was something new, or something old wearing a different mask. He reached for his first bag, preparing a draft to ease the man's suffering. But as he worked, he noticed the stains along the patient's collar, pale, almost pearlescent patches. Where the fog had settled, he rubbed the fabric between his fingers. It felt tacky. Wrong. Another cry erupted from upstairs. A child's scream, sharp and terrified. Then a crash, followed by frantic footsteps. The sickness was moving floor by floor, room by room, choosing victims with indiscriminate cruelty. Dr. Avery shut his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. He had hoped the second bag would not be necessary, but he had brought it for a reason. Mrs. Kavanaugh appeared beside him, Patrick clinging to her skirts. "Doctor," she said, voice shaking, "whatever this is, it's not like before. It's faster." He looked up at her, and something in his expression made her recoil. Not fear, resignation. "This building must be evacuated," he said quietly. "Every room opened, every window forced free. Burn anything that carries this scent. And no one, under any circumstances, is to drink from the pump." "But the pump is all we have," she whispered. "Then you must not drink," he replied. "Not unless you wish this entire district to fall." Another cough echoed through the building, deep rattling, more like a death rattle than a symptom. Dr. Avery stood lifting both bags now. The first, for those he might still save. The second, for those he would soon have to name. And as he ascended the stairs into the thickening fog, he understood the truth the city had not yet spoken. The sickness had found a new foothold, and it was learning to climb. In the height of July, when the city sweltered under a sun that bleached the rooftops and drove families onto fire escapes in search of the faintest breath of cooler air, it should have been impossible for any child to shiver. Heat pressed against windows like a living thing. The tenements baked. Laundry dried in minutes, and even the stray cats sprawled panting in the shadows. Yet little Emma Mallory, barely 7 years old, with hair the color of honey and a disposition as bright, lay trembling beneath her blankets as though winter had crept into her bones. Her mother, Lillian, hovered beside the bed, wringing her hands until the knuckles blanched. "She was fine last night," she whispered to the room, to no one in particular, as though saying it aloud could undo whatever had settled over her daughter. Fine, laughing, running. She even begged for ice cream. Her voice cracked. "And now look." Emma's small body quaked beneath the quilts, her lips tinged with violet, her breath shallow. The room itself was unbearably warm, the air heavy with the scent of stale sweat and wilting flowers, yet she shivered as fiercely as if frost rimed the windows. When Lillian pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead, Emma flinched, not from heat but from a chill so sharp it felt unnatural. Outside their door, the hallway murmured with panic. Word of the sickness spreading through the tenement had traveled quickly, and the building now hummed like a beehive disturbed. Feet shuffled back and forth, mothers whispered prayers, doors opened and closed with nervous haste, and through it all drifted the faint, persistent sweetness that had become the building's new and terrible perfume. Dr. Avery finally arrived, climbing the last step with a heaviness that came not from age, but from foreknowledge. He had already visited 3 rooms that morning, 3 rooms where once healthy tenants now lay pale as parchment, their breathing ragged, their eyes glazed. The sickness showed no consistency, no mercy, no pattern except speed. He knocked gently before entering. Lillian rushed toward him, her relief palpable. "Doctor, please. She's freezing in this heat." Avery approached the bedside and knelt. Emma's eyelids fluttered. A thin sheen of moisture clung to her skin, yet when he rested his fingers on her arm, he felt the unmistakable shock of cold. Cold like river water in early spring, cold like something that belonged nowhere near a child in summertime. He lifted her wrist, waited for the pulse, found it faint, but frantic. "Has she complained of thirst?" Avery asked. Lillian nodded frantically. "Yes, terribly. She drank from the pitcher on the landing yesterday. Everyone does. It's always been clean." The doctor's face tightened. He did not need to smell the pitcher to know. The sweetness had been carried farther than the boarding house, farther than the tenement. It was traveling, following the pipeline that fed half the neighborhood. He reached into his first bag, extracting a bottle of tincture meant to ease fever. But as he brought it close to Emma's lips, she recoiled, not from the medicine, but from something in the doctor's shadow, as though she sensed a presence the adults could not see. "She keeps saying," Lillian whispered, trembling, "that something touched her in the night, something warm at first, then cold, like fingers." Avery paused mid-motion. Many children imagined monsters. Few described them with such clarity, and fewer still shivered in July. Emma suddenly gasped, her small hand shooting out to clutch her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, voice thin as a thread, "it's coming back." A gust of warm air drifted through the open window, and yet Emma shuddered violently beneath it. The doctor set down his bottle. "This sickness," he murmured, "moves faster than any I have known. You must keep her warm, no matter how strange that feels. And no one in this building is to drink from the pump again." Lillian nodded desperately, tears slipping down her cheeks. But as Avery stood, he glanced once more at the trembling child, watching the way her breath fogged in the hot room, a mist no July day should produce. He felt it then, faint but real, the room's temperature dipping, the air shifting, as though something unseen had settled beside the bed, something that did not belong. Emma's eyes flickered open once more, wide with terror. "It's already here," she whispered, and this time the doctor believed her. The Waverly boarding house had always prided itself on discretion. Tenants came and went with the seasons, clerks, seamstresses, itinerant preachers, widows with trembling hands, each bearing their own private burdens. And Mrs. Halcombe, vigilant keeper of keys and secrets alike, ensured that the house maintained a veneer of quiet respectability. But now, as the strange sickness crept from room to room like a shadow learning to walk, the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a creature holding its breath. On the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway lined with faded portraits and ticking clocks, sat Room 11. Its door was shut, its curtains drawn, and a heavy brass key turned in the lock. No tenant walked that corridor anymore. No laughter spilled from the rooms nearby. Even the floorboard seemed unwilling to creak in its direction. Inside, the air was thick, stale as abandoned attics, and touched by the same faint sweetness that had haunted the water pitcher. The inhabitant of Room 11, a mild-mannered bookkeeper named Mr. Jonathan Pike, had fallen ill 2 days earlier. His symptoms had escalated with unnatural speed: dizziness, sudden chills, a fever that burned then vanished, leaving his skin cold and clammy. And then something else, something the tenants would not speak of but could not forget. The scream. It had shattered the stillness of dawn, a sound so sharp, so desperate, that it cut straight through the velvet curtains of the parlor and sent Mrs. Waverly clutching at her pearls. When the tenants rushed toward Room 11, they found the door bolted from within. Mr. Pike's voice had trembled through the wood, pleading for help, begging them not to open the door, then begging them to open it after all, as though he feared what lay on both sides. By the time Mrs. Halcombe arrived with Dr. Avery, the voice had gone quiet. Too quiet. Now, 2 days later, the door remained locked. No one dared enter except the doctor, and even he approached with a hesitation that betrayed his growing dread. The sickness was taking shapes he could not understand. It moved faster than cholera, more erratically than typhoid, and carried with it an unnatural warmth that clung to fabric and breath alike. Yet, he had to enter. Mrs. Halcombe hovered behind him, fingers trembling around the key. "He hasn't answered since yesterday morning," she whispered. "I brought food, left it by the door. When I returned, the tray was untouched." Avery nodded grimly. "Unlock it." She hesitated. "Doctor, when he screamed, he said something was in the room with him." "Yes," Avery said softly. "I heard." With a reluctant breath, she fit the key into the lock. The click echoed down the hallway like the cocking of a pistol. The door swung open. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The curtains hung motionless. The basin of water sat undisturbed. A book lay open on the bedside table, as though Mr. Pike had simply fallen asleep while reading. But then the smell hit them. Sweetness, thick, syrupy, cloying, so strong it masked even the scent of sickness. Avery lifted a handkerchief to his nose. Mrs. Halcombe gagged. "Mr. Pike?" Avery called softly. "Jonathan?" A low sound drifted from the darkness, not a groan, not a breath, but something between the two, a fluttering, like wings brushing against fabric. The doctor's pulse quickened. He stepped forward. There, in the far corner of the room, huddled against the wallpaper, sat Mr. Pike, or what remained of him. His eyes were open, glassy, unfocused, staring not at the doctor, but past him. His skin glistened with the same strange residue found in the pitcher, a pearlescent sheen that clung to him like a second skin. And his breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. Avery knelt beside him. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" Mr. Pike's lips moved. No sound emerged, only a trembling exhale that fogged the hot July air. And then, barely audible, "It's in the walls." The doctor stiffened. "What is?" Pike's eyes shifted, slowly, painfully, toward the ceiling, toward the shadows in the corners, toward the cracks in the plaster where the fog had begun to gather, curling, forming shapes that seemed almost purposeful. "The sweetness," Pike whispered. "It watches." Mrs. Halcombe stepped back, crossing herself. A faint tremor ran through the floorboards, as if something moved behind the walls, slow and searching. Dr. Avery closed his medical bag with trembling fingers. This was no ordinary plague. This was something that had learned to hide, and Room 11 was only its beginning. The morning train bound for Philadelphia cut across the countryside like an iron needle, stitching one trembling city to another. Its whistle shrieked through the mist, a thin cry swallowed quickly by the surrounding fields. Inside the passenger cars, the air was thick with the mingled scents of travel. Coal smoke clinging to wool coats, perfume wilting beneath the summer heat, and camphor, sharp and medicinal, radiating from the bundles of handkerchiefs clutched nervously in gloved hands. For weeks now, travelers had dabbed their scarves with camphor, convinced it could ward off whatever invisible threat stalked the cities. Mothers pressed camphor-soaked cloths to their children's collars. Men tucked camphor pellets into their breast pockets. Even the conductor carried a jar in his coat, touching it periodically as though it were a talisman against misfortune. But the scent inside car number 3 was too strong. Not protective, suffocating. Almost as if it were trying to mask something worse. Miss Eleanor Huxley, a schoolteacher returning from visiting relatives, noticed it first. She sat primly in her seat, her posture straight, her gloves immaculate, but her brow furrowed as she inhaled. "It smells," she murmured to the man beside her, as though someone has spilled an entire apothecary. The man, a businessman with weary eyes, adjusted his collar anxiously. "Better that," he said low, "than the smell that's rumored to be following the sickness." Eleanor stiffened. "What smell?" He hesitated, glancing around to ensure no conductor was listening. "Sweetness," he whispered. "Too sweet, like rotting fruit. Some say it's in the pumps, others say it drifts from the lungs of the dying." Eleanor swallowed hard. She remembered vaguely a similar scent near the train station that morning, a sweetness hidden beneath the coal smoke. She had dismissed it then. Now she wasn't so sure. As the train rattled forward, the camphor grew stronger, stinging her nose, making her eyes water. She reached into her bag for her own tin of camphor, but when she unscrewed it, the odor seemed faint, almost pleasant, compared to the thick wave rolling through the car. Something was wrong. At the far end of the aisle, a child began to cough, a small, polite cough at first, the sort that earns a gentle pat from a mother. But the cough grew deeper, rattling, as though clawing its way from the depths of the chest. Heads turned. The mother fumbled for a handkerchief. The child's breath fogged in the warm air. Eleanor froze. Fogging breath in July. The businessman beside her muttered, "Not here. God, not on the train." The conductor marched down the aisle, attempting bravery he did not feel. "Is there a physician on board?" he called. Eleanor rose, though she was no doctor. She moved toward the child, weaving between passengers who recoiled as though illness might leap from the air. The closer she came, the stronger the air, thickened, not with camphor alone, but with a scent beneath it, rising like a ghost beneath a blanket. Sweetness, heavy, clinging. When she reached the mother, she saw the truth. The woman's hands were shaking, her skin pale. The camphor pressed beneath her collar was drenched, the cloth nearly soaked through, as though she had emptied an entire vial onto herself. "Please," the mother whispered, "the conductor wouldn't let us off. He said the next station was safer." "But my Henry, he said he felt warm and cold at once." The boy shivered violently, his eyes half open, unfocused. Eleanor knelt beside him. "Henry," she murmured, brushing sweat from his forehead. His skin was both hot and icy. Impossible. Unnatural. A breath of air drifted through the cracked window, carrying the sweetness with it. It seemed to settle around the boy like a fine dust. Passengers drew back, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths. Someone whispered, "This is how it travels, through the trains, through us." The conductor appeared again, pale. "We'll stop at the next station," he said, but fear trembled beneath his voice. Outside, the landscape blurred, golden fields bending beneath a rising wind. Inside, panic swelled like tidewater. Henry suddenly clutched Eleanor's sleeve, his small fingers icy. "It's here," he rasped, the warm fog. Her heart lurched. He had never been near the tenements, yet he spoke the same words. A sudden jolt rocked the car. The conductor shouted. The train screeched, slowing with violent force. And for an instant, a single horrifying instant, the sweetness thickened into something visible, a faint shimmer drifting through the aisle, like breath exhaled by something unseen. Passengers screamed. Eleanor tightened her hold on the boy, forcing down her rising terror. "This," she whispered to herself, "is spreading far faster than we imagined." And when the train finally lurched to a halt at the next lonely station, the conductor refused to open the doors, too afraid of what might step out, or what might already be waiting to come in. The infirmary on Mulberry Street stood in a perpetual half-light, even at midday. Its tall, narrow windows admitted only slivers of sun, and the gas lamps, though carefully tended, cast more shadow than illumination. The walls were scrubbed daily with harsh disinfectants that left behind a sting in the air, mingling with the smells of poultices, ink, sweat, and quiet fear. Yet the most striking presence in that dimly lit refuge was Nurse Adelaide Marsh, known throughout the ward for her immaculate white gloves. She never removed them. Not to wash a patient, not to set a bone, not to administer laudanum, not even to comfort the dying. Some whispered she wore them out of vanity, an unwillingness to stain her hands with the city's misery. Others claimed she suffered a burn years ago and could not bear to touch skin. But the truth, like so many truths in that season of unrest, was far more unsettling. Adelaide was afraid. She arrived that morning with her posture straight, her chin held high, but the tightness in her shoulders betrayed a sleepless night. As she crossed the ward, the faint sweetness she had begun to notice in recent days clung to her senses like invisible syrup. She paused, breathing shallowly. It was stronger today, too strong. Her fellow nurse, Clara, waved to her with weary enthusiasm. "You're early," Clara murmured, adjusting a blood-stained apron. "We've 3 new cases from the River District, and the doctor wants you to see to the boy who came in on the morning train." Adelaide nodded stiffly. She had heard about the train, about the camphor-soaked passengers, the child who shook despite the heat. That description alone had chilled her, but it was what followed that troubled her more, the rumor that the air in the railway car had shimmered as though touched by something not wholly natural. She tightened her gloves and moved toward the first row of beds. Patients covered every available cot. Some moaned softly, their bodies curled like wilted flowers. Others lay unnervingly still, with breath so faint that she leaned close just to be sure life had not slipped from them. And all of them, every single one, carried that same faint pearlescent sheen somewhere on their skin, along the hairline, beneath the jaw, around the wrists, a residue that resisted scrubbing. She reached the cot nearest the window. It was the boy, Henry, from the train. He lay half-conscious, his small chest rising and falling with effort. His lips trembled. As Adelaide bent to adjust the blanket, he opened his eyes, startlingly wide for a child so ill. "Don't touch me," he whispered. Adelaide froze. "I'm only helping, dear." "No," he said, voice rasping like dry leaves. "If you touch me without them." His gaze flicked to her gloves. "It'll climb." A cold ripple traveled up her spine. "What will climb?" she asked. The boy swallowed painfully. "The warm fog." Her hand trembled. She adjusted her gloves. Clara approached, carrying a tray of tinctures. "He's delirious," she said lightly, though unease flickered across her features. "They've all been speaking strangely. One woman insisted there were hands in her drinking water." Adelaide did not smile. Instead, she asked, "Have any of the doctors determined what this is?" Clara shook her head. "They don't even agree on what it isn't." A sudden cry erupted from the far end of the ward. A patient had risen abruptly, gasping, clutching at her throat. Adelaide hurried to her, but the moment she reached to touch the woman's shoulder, the patient recoiled violently. "Don't!" the woman shrieked. "Your hands!" Adelaide pulled back. Her gloved hands hovered in the air, suspended between duty and dread. The woman's pupils were dilated. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. "It moves on skin," she whispered. "Skin to skin. It waits for warmth." Adelaide's stomach dropped. That was why she wore the gloves. Not vanity, not scars. Protection from something she could not yet name. By noon, 3 patients had collapsed. By 1, 2 more arrived from neighboring streets. And with each new body brought through the doors, that strange sweetness thickened, coating the air like invisible lacquer. As night approached, Adelaide paused beside the wash basin. She held her gloved hands over the water, watching the lamplight glint off the pale residue clinging to her sleeves. She dared not remove them. Not anymore. Her reflection in the basin's surface wavered, distorted by the faint ripples of her breath. And for the briefest moment, she saw something else hovering behind her reflection, a shape, a shadow, curling like fog, sweet as rot. She stepped back sharply. No, she would not remove the gloves, not tonight, not until she understood what hunted the air. and as she returned to her patients, the sweetness followed her like a quiet, dreadful companion. The Western Union office on Chambers Street usually hummed with the crisp, orderly rhythm of modern life, keys clacking, brass gears ticking, operators calling out confirmations as messages flowed like electric veins through the growing nation. Progress pulsed through those wires, invisible yet certain, a promise that no distance was too great for communication, no emergency too far to reach. But on this gray afternoon, the rhythm faltered. It began with a single stutter in the telegraph machine, a tiny hesitation, a breath caught in metal lungs. Then came another, and another. The operators exchanged wary glances. Machines did not stutter unless something had gone terribly wrong on the other end. At 3:17 p.m., the first alarming message came through, its letters dropping one by one like beads of cold sweat. Unusual mortality. 5th Ward. Stop request. Immediate physicians. Stop water contamination. Suspected. Stop. The operator reading it aloud faltered at mortality. He cleared his throat and repeated the message, but his voice wavered. Across the room, clerks paused mid-motion. Pens hovered above ink pots. Even the oldest, most unflappable telegraphist, Mr. Graves, a man unmoved by fire, riots, or financial panics, removed his spectacles and polished them with trembling fingers. At 3:22 p.m., a second message arrived. Children collapsing without fever. Stop sweet odor in pumps. Stop advise. Quarantine. Stop. The clerks muttered among themselves. Sweet odor. The words slithered through the office like smoke. Several of them had heard rumors of such sweetness near the river district, near the railways, near the tenements, where the sickness had begun threading its way through the cracks of the city. At 3:29 p.m., a third message screamed its way through the wires, urgent, frantic, its spacing uneven, as though the operator sending it could barely keep his hands steady. Something in the air stop. Patients breathe, turning cold. Stop. We cannot explain. Stop. The room fell silent. Air should not turn cold, not in July, not in the midst of a city sweating through another oppressive summer. But the reports were consistent. A chill where no chill should be. A sweetness that had no earthly source, and people collapsing with a speed that mocked the rules of ordinary illness. Miss Lydia Harrow, the office's youngest telegraph clerk, clutched the message slip so tightly that the crisp paper crumpled at the edges. She had a brother in the 5th Ward, a boy who liked to fetch water from the public pump because he believed it tasted fresher there. She stepped toward Mr. Graves. Shouldn't we warn the public? Send notices to the newspapers? Tell the Board of Health? Mr. Graves stared at the messages before him, his face ashen. Miss Harrow, he murmured, our duty is to transmit messages, not interpret them. But people are dying. Yes, he whispered, and that is precisely why we must not ignite panic. Before she could protest, the machine began clicking again, rapidly, feverishly, like teeth chattering in terror. The room rushed toward it, the tape spilled out, printing a message that made every operator recoil. Stop drinking from city pumps. Stop sweetness is warning. Stop it spreads fast. Stop no one is safe. Stop. The operator reading it burst into tears. Where did that come from? Someone demanded, but no one knew. The sender location was missing, the call code incomplete. It was as though the message had forced its way through the wires uninvited, urgent, desperate, anonymous. Miss Harrow backed away from the machine, her breath catching. This is not just illness, she whispered. This is movement. Something is moving. And as if to confirm her dread, a final message sputtered through, slower this time, irregular, as though the operator on the other end had faltered mid-transmission. Cannot see it stop, only feel it stop, sweet air rising through floorboards, stop, pray, stop, then silence. Not the usual lull of work, but a thick, suffocating stillness, as though the entire building, timbers, brick, wires and all, had inhaled and was afraid to exhale. Mr. Graves dropped heavily into his chair. Send for the Board of Health, he said at last. Send for anyone who will listen. But even as the clerks rushed to comply, Lydia Harrow felt something cold drift across her ankles, an icy brush, subtle yet unmistakable. She looked down. A faint shimmer curled along the floor, sweet-scented and warm at its edges. The telegraph had carried the warning. The air itself carried the truth. By the time dusk crept over the city, the streets were uneasy with rumor. Doors were bolted early, windows slammed shut despite the oppressive heat. Mothers kept their children close, whispering for them not to stray near the pumps, not to breathe too deeply near the riverfront, not to linger in doorways where the air seemed thicker than before. And when the gas lamps flickered to life along the avenues, something was wrong. They burned blue. It began in the Bowery, one lamp, then three, then an entire row. A thin, unnatural flame shimmered inside each glass globe, the light pale and cold, bending shadows into strange elongations that moved like living things. Passers-by halted, staring upward with knitted brows and tightening throats. Gas lamps did not burn blue, not unless the air was tainted, not unless something had changed. Old Mr. Cunningham, the lamplighter, stood below the nearest post, his ladder unused at his side. He scratched his beard with trembling fingers. "Never seen the likes of it," he muttered. "Blue flame means something in the air, something unnatural." The people nearest him edged back as though the lamp might shatter. But the lamps did not shatter. They hummed, softly, insistently, casting a glassy glow that froze the street in a spectral wash of color. Across the city, one district after another fell under the same eerie illumination. Children pointed from windows. Policemen rubbed their eyes and swore. Lovers out for evening strolls seized each other's hands, frightened without fully understanding why. Inside the Waverly boarding house, Mrs. Halcombe noticed the shift first. She stood in the parlor, staring through the lace curtains as the nearest street lamp glowed with that sickly blue flame. It made the shadows of the velvet drapes ripple like dark water. Behind her, Mrs. Waverly's empty chair sat untouched, its absence heavier than her presence had ever been. Upstairs, Dr. Avery was tending to another stricken tenant when he paused mid-motion. The faint light filtering through the window had altered the color of the sick man's skin, making it appear bluish, luminous, almost translucent. Avery pushed aside the curtain, dread washing through him as he beheld the strange lamps flickering across the neighborhood. Blue flame meant gas impurities, or a shift in atmospheric composition. And the sweetness, dear God, the sweetness still lingered, thicker tonight than ever. Meanwhile, over in the Fifth Ward, a group of factory workers leaving the night shift stopped under a gas lamp, staring up in wordless concern. One man, Tomas O'Leary, pulled his cap low and crossed himself. "It's the sickness," he whispered. "It's in the air. Mark me, the lamps know." A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, carrying with it that now familiar aroma, sweet, sticky, clinging. It drifted past like invisible smoke, wrapping itself around the lampposts. Several people coughed, stepping back, instinctively. And then the lamps brightened. Blue flared to a deeper, richer hue, as though the flame were feeding on something new. The glass vibrated with a faint hum that raised the hair on every arm nearby. Children cried, dogs howled, birds scattered from the rooftops in frantic clouds. In the telegraph office, Miss Lydia Harrow stood frozen as the lamps outside cast their strange glow through the window, transforming her reflection into a pale, ghostly version of herself. The wires above her head buzzed, as though responding to the atmospheric disturbance. She clutched the telegraph key, unable to shake the sensation that the air itself was listening. On the train platform, Eleanor Huxley felt the temperature drop despite the heat wave. Blue light shimmered across the tracks, bending the fog around it into delicate, swirling shapes that vanished before she could fully perceive them. Back at the tenement on Broome Street, little Patrick pressed his face to the window and whispered, "Mama, it's here too." His mother pulled him away sharply. "Don't look," she hissed, but her own eyes could not leave the unnatural flame. By midnight, reports flooded the police precincts. Gas lamps burning wrong color. Air thick. Residents fainting. One officer wrote shakily in his ledger, "The blue lamps seemed to breathe." And indeed, in certain quarters of the city, the flames did appear to pulse, growing and shrinking ever so slightly, like lungs expanding and contracting. Dr. Avery returned to the boarding house corridor, staring at the wavering light that seeped through the windows. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely more than a breath. The sickness is no longer contained indoors. It has reached the streets. Outside, the lamps continued to burn their spectral blue, cold flame for a hot night, a sign, a warning, a harbinger. Something unseen had entered the city's air, and the lamps, helpless witnesses, revealed the truth. Morning broke with a deceptive gentleness. Birds chirped along the rooftops, milk carts rattled down the cobblestones, and the city, tired, anxious, but stubborn, tried to pretend that this day would resemble any other. But beneath the surface, something coiled, something waiting. By noon, it struck. The first scream echoed from a bakery on Baxter Street, startling horses and sending flour drifting like ghost powder into the air. A young woman, Anna Brewer, the baker's daughter, had collapsed mid-step, her mixing bowl shattering beside her. Her mother rushed to her but recoiled instantly at the chilled, clammy feeling of the girl's skin. "It's the heat," someone muttered. "No," another whispered. "It's the sweetness. What else could it be?" Anna's lips had turned a strange bluish tint, not from cold. No one could be cold in this suffocating July heat, but from something draining life faster than breath could protect it. Her body convulsed. Then came the water, violent, uncontrolled, relentless, cholera, but not the cholera doctors had faced in years past, not the predictable terror that ravaged without cunning. This version was swift, merciless, almost impatient. Anna went from standing to gasping on the floor in minutes. Her skin tightened, her eyes hollowed. Her mother screamed for help, but help was already running elsewhere. Across the street, a fruit vendor collapsed into his baskets of peaches, his hands trembling as though electrified. On the corner, a policeman bent double, retching into the gutter while pedestrians scattered in horror. The trolley conductor staggered out of his car, gripping the frame as though the city itself were tilting beneath him. One of the passengers inside whispered, "The lamps burned blue last night. Look what follows." Word reached the infirmary before the bodies did. Nurse Adelaide Marsh rushed to clear space for incoming patients, though space was already a luxury. Beds had been filled since dawn. Cots lined the hallways. Men lay on floor mats made from rolled blankets, their breath rattling in unison like broken machinery. When the door burst open, a pair of frantic neighbors carried Anna Brewer inside, her limbs dangling as though strings had been cut. Adelaide hurried toward them, her gloved hands shaking despite her practiced composure. "Set her down, here, quickly," she instructed, motioning them to a cot. Anna convulsed again. The sweet chemical scent of the sickness rose from her skin. Adelaide caught only a whiff, but even that was enough to make her vision blur for a moment. She steadied herself. Dr. Avery arrived almost instantly, already sweating through his collar. "How long since symptoms began?" he demanded. 10 minutes, Anna's mother sobbed. Less, perhaps less. 10 minutes. Impossible. Even the worst cholera took hours. Avery's expression darkened. He examined the girl, lifting her eyelid, feeling her pulse, studying the pale residue collecting at her temples. His jaw tensed. "This is accelerated," he whispered to Adelaide. "Something has changed. Perhaps something has combined." "Combined?" she echoed. He did not elaborate. Outside the infirmary, crowds gathered, restless and fearful. People clutched handkerchiefs soaked in camphor, though camphor had lost its pretense of power. Mothers dragged children indoors. Shopkeepers bolted doors. The sound of rushing feet filled the streets like distant thunder. Then, another collapse, and another, and another. Within the hour, a dozen people lay stricken. By evening, dozens more. Cholera's grip tightened around the city not like a wave, but like a hand, one that squeezed swiftly, purposefully, almost knowingly. Back in the infirmary, Anna Brewer took one last shuddering breath. Her mother clutched her hand until Adelaide gently pried her fingers away. "We must take her," the nurse whispered. Mrs. Brewer wailed, the sound cracking the room in two. Dr. Avery closed his eyes. "Record the time of death," he murmured, but Adelaide did not move. She stared at the pale residue on the girl's skin, the same sheen from the tenements, the same shimmer from the boarding house walls, a sheen that seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight, as though responding to the blue glow burning outside, as though aware. And Adelaide felt it then, felt the air shift, felt the sweet scent coil around her like a serpent's breath. Cholera had returned to the city, but it was not alone. Not anymore. The Harrington Street schoolhouse had always smelled faintly of chalk dust, ink, and the warm, restless energy of children who longed to be anywhere but seated upright at their wooden desks. Sunlight usually poured through its tall windows, illuminating rows of slates and well-worn textbooks, and the walls carried the echoes of recitations, laughter, and the nervous shuffling of students reciting multiplication tables. But this morning, the light felt colder. Miss Eleanor Huxley, who only yesterday had sat trembling beside a fevered boy on the train, stood before her class with her hands clasped tightly, willing her voice not to betray the unease coiling in her stomach. She had slept poorly, haunted by the sweetness that clung to the railway car air, by the child's shivering, by the conductor's refusal to let anyone disembark. Yet she had arrived as always, her posture composed, her smile dutiful. "Good morning, children," she said. A chorus of voices responded, but even their cheerful greeting sounded brittle, thin. Halfway through the morning arithmetic lesson, Eleanor noticed the first sign. Little Clara Whitmore, normally the brightest, sharpest, most eager girl in the room, was slumped over her slate, rubbing her eyes with trembling hands. Her skin looked unusually pale beneath her freckles. "Clara?" Eleanor approached gently. "Are you unwell?" The girl looked up, and Eleanor's heart dropped. A faint rose-colored spot had bloomed near her temple, small, innocent-looking, but unmistakable. A rash, and not just any rash. The first mark of smallpox. Eleanor had seen etchings in medical pamphlets, had heard stories years ago from an elderly teacher who survived an outbreak as a child, but nothing had prepared her for the texture of dread that washed over her now. The rash was not alone. Another spot near the corner of Clara's mouth, and, dear heavens, another on her wrist. "Have you felt feverish?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Clara nodded weakly. "I felt hot last night, miss, but this morning, I'm cold. Cold. Always cold. Even in this suffocating heat, illness brought unnatural frost." Eleanor touched the child's forehead with the back of her hand and flinched. The skin was burning, yet Clara shivered violently. The classroom fell silent as the other children watched in widening horror. They knew illness. They lived in a city crowded with sorrow. But smallpox carried a special place in their whispered nightmares. A disease with a reputation older than any of them, older than their parents, older than half the buildings on their street. "Class," Eleanor said softly, "please remain seated." But it was too late. Another child, Benjamin Clark, dropped his slate with a loud crack. A rash had appeared beneath his ear, red and spreading. He choked out a gasp, clutching his stomach. His seatmate scrambled away, knocking over his chair. Within moments, chaos erupted. Some children screamed. Others scrambled for the door. A few pressed themselves against the walls, hands over their mouths, eyes bright with terror. But the part that chilled Eleanor most was the scent, faint, almost hidden beneath the smell of ink and chalk, but present. The sweetness, thickening, settling into the corners of the schoolroom like fog. She grabbed the edge of a desk to steady herself. The disease was not just appearing. It was spreading with purpose. The headmaster arrived moments later, having heard the commotion. His face blanched when he saw Clara and Benjamin. "Miss Huxley, close the doors. No one leaves this room until a doctor arrives." "But the ventilation is less dangerous than releasing contagion into the street." He locked the door himself. The children sobbed. Eleanor's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She went from child to child, checking for rashes, fevers, chills. Several already showed early symptoms: a flush in the cheeks, a dimming of the eyes, a tremble in the hands. She knelt beside Clara again. "Miss Huxley," the girl whispered. "The lamps outside were blue last night. Mama said it meant something bad was coming." The lamps, the telegraph warnings, the fog in the tenements, the sweetness in the water. Illnesses that normally struck separately were moving in tandem, stacked atop one another like shadows merging. Smallpox should not have arrived here today, but it had, drawn perhaps by whatever unseen force now haunted the city's air. The schoolroom dimmed as a cloud passed the sun, leaving the children in a pallid half-light. Eleanor held Clara's trembling hand, her gloves doing little to protect her from the cold radiating through the child's skin. A knock sounded at the door. Dr. Avery's voice came through, tired and firm. "Miss Huxley, step back." She did. The lock turned. The door creaked open. He took one look inside and closed his eyes in pained resignation. "It's begun here as well," he whispered. And as he entered the schoolroom, the sweet scent followed him, an omen carried like breath on the wind. The Kensington mansion had always taken pride in being a world apart from the noise and grime of the city. Marble floors gleamed like frozen lakes, chandeliers glittered with the arrogance of wealth, servants moved in quiet, choreographed precision, their footsteps muffled by carpets imported from Paris. Even the air seemed curated, perfumed with lilies, warmed by coal-fired grates, untouched by the sweat and sorrow that clung to the tenements. But in the kitchen, the hidden heart of the mansion, something had begun to sour. Martha Bellamy, the head cook for nearly 20 years, prided herself on her spotless domain. Copper pots hung shining above the stove. The butcher's block was scrubbed until it nearly vanished beneath layers of sanded, smooth wood. And the water, always drawn from the mansion's private pump, was considered the purest in the neighborhood. Yet this afternoon, as she prepared luncheon for the Harrington family upstairs, Martha paused mid-motion. The water she had just poured into a glass pitcher shimmered strangely in the light, not clouded, not dirty, just thickened, as though it held a weight it had never possessed before. She sniffed it. Sweetness, soft, clinging sweetness. "Strange," she murmured. A scullery maid, young Elsie Warren, darted past her with a stack of plates. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Harrington says the baby hasn't stopped fussing. Wants a cool cloth for his head." Martha frowned. "Is the child feverish?" Elsie nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Burning hot." Heat in a summer child was no rarity, but what unsettled Martha was the look in Elsie's eyes, fear, sharp and unmasked. "Fetch Dr. Avery," Martha ordered, "at once." But Avery was already consumed by the fires of sickness raging through the poorer districts. The wealthy, believing themselves insulated, had waited too long. As Martha filled a basin with water from the pitcher, she felt another odd sensation. The handle of the jug seemed warm, though the water itself was cool, a contradiction that prickled at her skin. She carried the basin upstairs, the scent of lilies thickening with every step. Mrs. Harrington, pale as ivory, paced the nursery with trembling hands. The child in the crib whimpered, his cheeks flushed, his small chest rising and falling with distress. "Perhaps it is the heat," Mrs. Harrington whispered, though the room was unusually cool. "He drank little this morning, only a sip from the nursery pitcher." Martha froze. "What pitcher?" "The one left by the maid at dawn." But Martha had not filled any pitcher this morning. Elsie had, and Elsie had drawn the water from... Her stomach tightened. "Ma'am," Martha said carefully, "you mustn't give the child any more from that source." Mrs. Harrington blinked. "Why ever not?" Before Martha could answer, a cry burst from the hallway. Another servant, Thomas the footman, stumbled inside, clutching his abdomen. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and his eyes were sunken, ringed with sweat. I drank from the pump," he gasped, and collapsed onto the nursery floor. Mrs. Harrington screamed. Martha dropped the basin. Water splashed across the polished wood, leaving streaks that glistened with that same faint sheen she had noticed earlier. Typhoid. She recognized the signs at once. She had seen it ravage working-class families, leaving entire households silent within days. But never here. Not in Kensington. Not in a mansion whose residents believed themselves lifted above the reach of such horrors. Yet, disease did not respect silk or brass or marble. As Martha knelt beside Thomas, she smelled it, the same sweetness haunting the tenements, the schoolroom, the train car. It clung to the breath of the fallen footman. It hovered above the child's crib. It drifted from the basin water, twisting softly in the nursery light. Mrs. Harrington collapsed beside her. "What is happening to us?" she whispered. "We are clean. We are careful. We are vulnerable," Martha finished quietly. From the crib, the baby let out a strangled cry, then fell eerily still. Martha rushed forward, but her hands trembled as she lifted him. His forehead was burning, his eyelids fluttered, and around his neck, below the soft folds of his skin, She saw it. A pale, pearlescent residue, the same shimmering trace that had followed every victim so far. Elsie appeared in the doorway, panting. "The doctor won't be here soon. They say he's overwhelmed. Half the city's gone ill." Mrs. Harrington began to weep. Martha held the child close, though fear clawed at her chest. Typhoid had entered the mansion kitchen, entered the nursery, entered their water, and no amount of wealth, polish, or privilege could keep the sweetness at bay. There was a peculiar cruelty in the way consumption entered a home. It did not burst through the door like cholera, nor did it carve its path with the angry blotches of smallpox. No, it slipped in like a guest of refinement, quiet and unannounced, taking a seat in the parlor as though invited. It brushed its cold fingers along velvet drapes. It lingered in the folds of lace. It made itself comfortable in drawing rooms where soft laughter once drifted beneath the gaslight. In such a room sat Miss Isabella Crane, the daughter of a well-respected banker whose fortune was considered untouchable. She had always been a picture of grace, gloved hands poised like porcelain, hair pinned with impeccable precision, her pale complexion admired rather than questioned. But lately, admiration had turned to whispers. She had grown thinner, her cheeks hollowed, her eyes too luminous, brilliant, fever-bright, and her cough, delicate, yes, but persistent. On this particular evening, as Isabella prepared for her weekly salon gathering, she paused before the gilded mirror. Her reflection looked ethereal, almost ghostly, bathed in the faint blue glow of the gas lamps outside. She dabbed powder across her cheek, but it did little to conceal the slight tremor in her jaw. Her maid, Lottie, hovered anxiously nearby. "Miss, perhaps tonight we might cancel the gathering. You've been so tired, so pale." "Nonsense," Isabella said softly, her voice brittle as pressed flowers. "I simply need a moment to compose myself." But when her next cough came, she caught it in a lace handkerchief and froze. A bloom of red dotted the delicate white threads. She quickly folded the fabric, hiding the stain from Lottie's gaze. "Open the windows," Isabella murmured. "The room feels close." Lottie obeyed, but when she pulled the drapes aside, the air that pushed in carried that strange, sickly sweetness that had begun haunting the city. It curled into the room, settling among the parlor furniture as though claiming space. The gas lamps outside flickered blue, and the shadows they cast stretched unnaturally across the walls. Isabella shivered. Her guests arrived shortly thereafter, ladies in pale silk, gentlemen with polished boots, all unaware of how disease could slip through wealth's defenses as easily as sunlight through stained glass. They gathered with wineglasses in hand, offering polite laughter that trembled just slightly with shared, unspoken fear. For even in these affluent circles, news had spread. The lamps, the water, the telegraph warnings, the sweet air that signaled death. Isabella greeted them with her usual elegance, though she leaned subtly on the back of furniture as she moved. "You look lovely," one friend remarked, though pity darkened her eyes. Consumption had a way of making beauty sharper, more fragile, tragically luminous. The conversation drifted, but Isabella found it difficult to breathe. The sweetness in the air seemed thicker tonight, pressing against her throat. Her cough returned, soft at first, then deeper, wrenching. Her guests fell silent. She tried to wave off their concern, but another cough seized her, violent, tearing. She clutched her handkerchief, but blood soaked through the lace, blooming like a morbid rose. Gasps filled the room. "Fetch a doctor!" someone cried. Lottie bolted for the stairs. Isabella sank into a chair, breath shallow, eyes wide with a terror she could no longer conceal. Her chest felt constricted, as though cold hands were pressing inward. Her fingers trembled against her bodice. And then she saw it. Near the open window, where the blue lamplight spilled into the room, the air shimmered. A faint, pearlescent haze drifted upward, curling like a ribbon. It hovered near the ceiling, almost invisible, almost delicate, yet unmistakably alive in its movement. No one else seemed to see it. Isabella's lips parted. Her breath fogged faintly in the warm room. Lottie returned with Dr. Avery, but the moment he stepped inside, he stiffened. He smelled it, the sweetness, the warning. He rushed to Isabella's side, pressing fingers to her wrist, inspecting the blood-soaked lace. His jaw tightened. She must be moved to the infirmary at once, he said. Consumption does not behave this way unless something else, something far worse, is at work. The guests recoiled. Lottie began to weep. Isabella, pale and trembling, whispered, "Doctor, it's in the air, isn't it?" Avery met her gaze. He did not lie. Yes. Outside, the blue flame wavered, then flared. And inside the Crane mansion, the elegant killer took a deeper breath. Scarlet fever had always carried a certain cruel irony. It arrived like a blush, innocent in appearance, almost pretty in its early bloom, before revealing the violence beneath its rosy mask. Mothers recognized its early signs in whispers: flushed cheeks too bright for health, a warmth in the skin that spoke not of exertion but of invasion, a rash that crept like fire beneath the surface. But this season, the blush did not merely appear. It flared at the Oak Ridge Orphan Asylum, where 67 children lived, stacked in narrow dormitories beneath the thin kindness of charity. The disease made its entrance at dawn. Matron Davies, a stern woman with iron-gray hair and a voice that brooked no disobedience, climbed the staircase with her usual briskness, only to stop short at the sight of little Margaret O'Doyle sitting upright in bed, her skin glowing with a crimson so vivid it seemed lit from within. "Margaret," the matron whispered, a rare tremor loosening her voice. "Child, what have you—" But the girl's eyes told the story before her lips ever could, wide, glassy, terrified. "It burns," Margaret breathed. The rash blazed across her arms like painted fire. When Matron Davies pressed her palm to the girl's forehead, she felt heat so fierce it nearly scalded her. Yet Margaret shivered beneath the touch. "Fetch cold water," she barked to a passing maid. But even as she spoke, she felt it, the air around the child warm, sweet, clinging, like exhaled breath that refused to disperse. More footsteps echoed up the hall. More children stirred, and as the sun rose, so too did the fever. By 7 o'clock, 9 children showed the scarlet bloom. By 8, 17. By 9, 23 lay in their beds trembling like leaves caught in a storm. The infirmary quickly overflowed. Cots were dragged into classrooms, hallways, even the broom closet. Everywhere the disease traveled, it dragged the sweetness with it, thick, syrupy, unmistakable. Dr. Avery arrived breathless, coat undone, hair disheveled from too many sleepless nights. Adelaide Marsh followed close behind, her gloves pristine but trembling. "Matron," he said urgently, "you must isolate every child showing symptoms." "I have," she answered, "but it spreads too quickly, faster than I've ever seen." The doctor examined Margaret first. She stared up at him, her small throat mottled with crimson, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Doctor," she whispered, "it's warm even when it's cold. It's all around us. I felt it before the rash came." Avery exchanged a look with Adelaide. They had heard similar testimonies in the tenements, in the schoolroom, on the train, a fever that arrived hand in hand with the sweet creeping warmth. "Open every window," Avery ordered. "Let the air move." But when the windows were raised, the outside air drifted inward, thick with that same sweetness. Adelaide recoiled. "It's out!" There, too. The matron crossed herself. Children began crying in nearby rooms, not from pain, though pain they had, but from terror. One claimed shadows crawled beneath his bed. Another said he heard breathing, though no one stood near. A third insisted the walls felt warm to the touch. Avery forced himself to focus. "Scarlet fever alone cannot do this," he murmured. "This intensity, this speed." He traced a finger over Margaret's rash. It shimmered faintly beneath the light, as though reflecting something not visible to the eye. The bloom spread not just because of bacteria or the city's density or the heat wave. It spread because something rode on the sickness, twisting it, sharpening it, painting it bright. As Avery stepped back, Margaret suddenly sat upright, her eyes wide and glassy. "It's coming," she whispered. "Who?" Adelaide asked softly, but the child shook her head. "Not who." She lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the doorway, where a faint shimmer curled upward like breath made visible. "It." The sweetness intensified, thick enough to taste. Adelaide staggered. The matron clutched her chest. The children whimpered in unison, their fevered bodies sensing what the adults refused to name. Scarlet fever had bloomed in crimson, but something far older, far stranger had bloomed right beside it, feeding on it, traveling with it, watching through it. And the fever was only the first gesture in its spreading hand. The quarantine line at the city's southern wharf had once been a mere formality. A row of painted posts, a rope barrier, a few uniformed officers tasked with inspecting cargo from the warmer ports. Yellow fever, after all, belonged to humid southern swamps and mosquito-ridden marshes, not to a northern metropolis wrapped in stone and industry. The wealthy merchants who oversaw the docks often joked that even disease would think twice before braving the city's smoke-choked air. But that was before the sweetness appeared, before the lamps burned blue, before cholera, smallpox, typhoid, and scarlet fever began blooming together like a grotesque bouquet. Now the quarantine line resembled a battlefield trench. Barricades of stacked crates, sandbags, and iron posts formed a desperate wall between the harbor and the city. Officers in thick coats, despite the July heat, paced back and forth with lanterns swinging at their sides. Their boots splashed through water tinged with an oily sheen that drifted from the docked ships. The air smelled wrong, not just of salt, tar, and rotting wood, but of sweetness, heavy, cloying, carried by a breeze too warm to belong to the sea. At dusk, the latest ship arrived. The Marietta, once a proud trading vessel, now limped into harbor with its sails slack and its lanterns dim. Its flag hung at half-mast. No crew member called out. No footsteps thudded against the deck. The silence radiating from the ship was so profound that even gulls circled warily, refusing to land. Captain Rollins, commander of the quarantine line, lifted his lantern as the ship drifted to a halt. "Boarding party," he ordered, but his officers hesitated. Rumors had spread for days, dockhands collapsing with no warning, fishermen returning home with feverish eyes and strange marks on their wrists, sailors insisting they felt watched in the fog. Rollins cursed under his breath. "Then I'll go myself." He boarded the ship alone. The deck was deserted, ropes slack, tools abandoned, a pipe still warm beside a coiled length of rope. The faint sweetness grew stronger as he moved forward, clinging to the wooden planks like invisible frost. "Hello," Rollins called. "This is the city quarantine inspection. Show yourselves." Silence answered. He pushed open the door to the lower deck and froze. The crew lay where they had fallen. Some slumped against barrels, others sprawled across crates, but none bore the yellowed pallor typical of yellow fever. Instead, their skin glistened faintly in the lamplight, with that same pearlescent sheen Dr. Avery had seen on the tenement victims. The same shimmer found in the mansion nursery. The same residue clinging to the city's sick. Rollins stepped back instinctively, but something else caught his eye. The ship's water barrels, every last one, had a thin, sweet-smelling film across their surface. The liquid shimmered subtly, as though disturbed by a breath no human had taken. A creak sounded above him. Rollins spun around just as a sailor stumbled from the shadows. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his breath fogged in the warm air. "Get back," the sailor whispered. Rollins grabbed him. "What happened here? Speak, man!" The sailor shivered violently. "We thought it was fever, but it wasn't. We stayed near the water barrels. It came out of them, warm at first, then cold." Rollins felt a chill ripple through him. What came out? The sailor's gaze drifted toward the darkness behind him. Then he collapsed. Rollins staggered backward, running for the deck, lantern swinging wildly. He leapt onto the dock, shouting for the barricade to be sealed. "No one enters the city!" he roared. "Burn the ship! Burn it before the tide shifts!" Officers scrambled, hauling barrels of kerosene, striking matches with shaking hands. But as they prepared to torch the vessel, a soft wind blew inland, carrying the sweetness with it. Across the quarantine line, across the barricades, across the men who trembled as they smelled it, Rollins felt the air turn warm against his face. Too warm. He backed away, heart pounding. "It's moving," he whispered. "It doesn't need the crew anymore. It doesn't need the ship." Behind him, one of the lamps along the wharf flickered, then burned blue. The officers dropped their torches in terror. The wind shifted again, curling like fingers around their coats. Yellow fever had not breached the quarantine line. Something else had, and it was already past them. Diphtheria had always been a quiet killer. It did not roar through the body like cholera, nor bloom in crimson like scarlet fever. It crept. It gathered itself in the throat's softest places, weaving a gray membrane that doctors feared and parents prayed against. It stole breath, not violently, but with dreadful patience, as though savoring each inch of air denied. But this time, something was different. This time, it whispered. In the dim corridors of St. Catherine's Home for Working Girls, the night watchwoman, Mrs. Penrose, sat knitting beneath a flickering gas lamp. The girls slept in narrow rows behind closed doors, poor things, exhausted by long shifts in factories and laundries. Mrs. Penrose had just begun to doze when she heard it, a soft, rasping sound, not a cough, not a cry, a whisper, so faint she almost mistook it for the rustle of fabric. She rose slowly, lantern trembling in her hand, and moved toward the dormitory. The air grew warmer as she walked, thick with that faint sweetness that now clung to the city like a perfume gone rotten. The whisper came again. This time she recognized it, a girl struggling to breathe. She burst into the dormitory and gasped. One of the older girls, Ruth Abbott, sat upright in her bunk, both hands pressed to her throat. Her breath came in thin, high-pitched rasps, the unmistakable beginning of a diphtheria membrane forming in her airway. Her eyes bulged with terror. Mrs. Penrose rushed to her side. "Ruth, darling, try to stay calm. I'll fetch the doctor." But Ruth shook her head violently, tears streaming. "It's not just the air," she choked out. "It's talking." The watchwoman stiffened. "Talking?" Ruth nodded, gasping. "It whispers to me. Warm at first, then cold, like someone breathing inside my throat." Mrs. Penrose felt her own skin crawl. The air in the room shimmered faintly, as though heated by a fire that did not exist. She could see her lantern flame bending toward the beds, as if drawn by a current she could not feel. And hovering above each sleeping girl was the faintest sheen, like morning dew struck by moonlight. She backed toward the hallway. "I'm fetching Dr. Avery, now." But as she turned, a soft chorus of breaths rose behind her, rasping, straining, whispering. More girls were waking, 27 in all. Within minutes, Dr. Avery arrived, still smelling of coal smoke and disinfectant. Nurse Adelaide Marsh followed him, her gloves pulled tight, her face pale with exhaustion. They entered the dormitory and froze. The air was wrong. It moved wrong. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, as if expanding and contracting in rhythm with the girls' strangled breaths. Avery approached Ruth. "Open your mouth, child." She obeyed, tears streaking her cheeks. A gray membrane was forming, faster than any Avery had seen. It looked almost alive, quivering in the lantern light. As he leaned in, a faint warmth brushed his cheek, sweet as rotting fruit, soft as a sigh. He recoiled. "It's accelerating," Adelaide whispered. "Just like the cholera, just like the scarlet rash." Avery nodded grimly. Something is amplifying each illness, something riding on the air. Behind them, another girl began to choke, then another, and another. The room filled with ragged gasps, like wind forcing its way through broken shutters. But beneath the gasps, Avery heard it too, a whisper, soft, sultry, indistinguishable from breath, almost like a lullaby, low, rhythmic, coaxing the illness deeper. He looked toward the back wall, where the shadows were thickest, and for a fleeting moment he saw movement, a shimmer, a curl of warm fog spiraling toward the ceiling, weaving between the beds like a serpent tasting the air. Adelaide reached for his arm. "Doctor, we need to evacuate them." "Yes," he whispered, "now." But when they began to move the girls, the fog turned cold, bitingly cold. The girls screamed as the chill wrapped around their throats, tightening the membrane, choking their breath. Avery shouted, "Open the windows!" But as the panes flew upward, the outside air came rushing in, and it was warm, sweet, alive. The sweetness wrapped itself around the dormitory, settling like silk over every bed. The girls' whispers rose to a crescendo, ragged, terrified, desperate. Ruth Abbott clutched Avery's sleeve with icy fingers. "It's not diphtheria, sir. It's using diphtheria." Avery felt his blood run cold. In that moment, he understood. The sickness was no longer merely sickness. It was a voice, a presence, moving between diseases like a puppeteer pulling strings. And diphtheria was only its newest instrument. The harbor had seen its share of grim arrivals, ships limping in after storms, vessels bearing the wounded from distant conflicts, barges carrying the unclaimed dead after winters too bitter to survive. But nothing in living memory resembled the dread that settled over the waterfront on the morning the Mercy Hill appeared. It emerged through the fog like an omen, its hull streaked with brine, its sails hanging in tatters, its lanterns extinguished though dawn had already broken. No signal flag fluttered from the mast. No shouts rang from the deck. It drifted, silent as a corpse, until it reached the quarantine buoy where it finally shuddered to a halt. Longshoremen froze mid-lift. Fishermen stared with forks suspended above half-cleaned nets. Even gulls, those shameless scavengers of the docks, circled but refused to land. "Another fever ship," murmured old Calder, the harbor guide. But even he stepped backward. It was not yellow fever this time, and not cholera. The city knew those scents, sharp, acidic, unmistakable. This scent was sweet, the same sweetness that haunted the pumps, the tenements, the orphanage, a sweetness so dense it clung to the fog like perfume on a morning veil. A whistle blew as Captain Rollins, still sleepless from the tragedy aboard the Marietta, marched to the shoreline, flanked by officers whose faces had grown paler by the day. Dr. Avery had been summoned from the infirmary and now approached with Adelaide Marsh at his side. Her gloves trembled. "No one boards until we understand what we face," Rollins declared. But even as he spoke, a sound drifted from the ship, a low thud, then another. Footsteps, slow, dragging, uneven. Adelaide clutched her coat tight. Dear God, someone's alive. But Avery felt only dread. People did not walk like that unless pulled forward by something stronger than their own failing will. Rollins signaled. "Prepare the launch." The small boat cut through the water, its oars dipping into sea tinted with an unnatural sheen, flecks of pale, pearly residue drifting like sickled foam. The closer they drew, the heavier the sweetness became. Adelaide pressed a handkerchief to her nose, but could still taste it, thick, cloying, wrong. When they reached the ladder, no sailor leaned down to greet them. Rollins ascended first. Avery followed, lantern in hand. Adelaide hesitated, but climbed after them. Duty over fear. The deck that greeted them felt abandoned in haste. Tools, clothing, crates, all lay scattered, untouched for days. But it was the silence that froze them. The silence and the warmth. Warmth rising from the planks, warmth that did not belong to wood or sun. Rollins approached the hatch. "Stand ready," he whispered. He pushed it open. The lantern light spilled downward, revealing bodies. Dozens of sailors lay twisted in unnatural positions as though seized mid-collapse, but their faces bore expressions not of pain, but of astonishment. Eyes wide, mouths parted, as though they had seen something in their final moment. Something impossible. Adelaide swallowed hard. "The same sheen," she whispered, "as the others." Avery knelt, touching a sailor's coat. It felt warm. Then, a voice. A hoarse, ragged whisper from behind a barrel. Rollins lunged forward. "Show yourself." A figure rose, slowly, swaying. A man, though barely recognizable as such. His skin was pale, glistening, his breath fogged in the warm air. Avery stepped closer. "Sir, what happened on this vessel?" The man's lips parted. "It came from the water," he rasped. "We drank, we washed, we breathed it, and then it learned us." A chill gripped Adelaide's spine. "Learned?" But the sailor did not answer. His gaze drifted upward toward the underside of the deck beams, where a faint shimmer curled in the shadows, moving like breath, like thought, like hunger. Avery whispered, "We must leave. Now." But the sailor grabbed his sleeve with icy fingers. Too late. Above them, the fog thickened, sweet, warm, pulsing. Rollins shouted, "Retreat! Back to the launch!" They scrambled toward the ladder, the sailor collapsing behind them with a soft sigh. As their boat pushed off, Adelaide looked back once. The shimmer had reached the rail, gathered there, watching. The Mercy Hill floated in the fog, silent, patient, almost expectant. A ship that did not carry plague, but something that used plague as clothing, something learning, traveling, choosing, and the harbor wind carried its sweetness inland. The town of Marrow's Crossing had always been proud of its distance from the great city's chaos. Nestled between two low hills and fed by a narrow river that shimmered like glass in the summertime, it fancied itself immune to the calamities that beset crowded streets and smoke-choked alleys. Merchants boasted that their water tasted sweeter, their air blew cleaner, their children ran healthier. Even the church bell rang with a clarity rarely heard in the industrial basin. But pride has a way of drawing shadows. The first signs came quietly. A farmer collapsed in his field, soil staining his palms as he shivered in the noon heat. A washerwoman felt faintness steal her breath, then saw her own exhalation fog in warm air. A child refused to drink from the town pump, claiming it smelled like sugar gone wrong. By dusk, the town square buzzed with unease. "Did you hear of the sickness in the city?" one shopkeeper whispered. "They say the lamps burn blue." "Blue lamps or not," a blacksmith retorted, "that's miles away. We're safe here." But even as he spoke, the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that did not belong, sweetness, soft and wrong, threading through Marrow's Crossing like invisible silk. That night, the town council met inside the Apple warehouse. Lanterns cast jittery shadows across stacked crates as the mayor pounded his fist upon a wooden table. "If this illness is coming our way," he declared, "we must leave before it reaches our borders. Evacuation at dawn." Murmurs erupted. "Evacuate and go where?" "The sickness is in the air. They say it follows people, not places." "My cousin fled north only to fall ill on the road," yet panic moved faster than reason. By first light, the town was in motion. Families bundled their belongings onto wagons. Horses stamped nervously, snorting at the sweetness drifting through the morning breeze. Mothers pressed cloths to their children's faces. Men boarded windows and locked doors, not to protect what was inside, but to bar something they could not see from following them. The mayor stood at the gate shouting orders. "Take only what you must. Move quickly. Once we reach the ridge, we will decide our next route." But as the first wagon rolled forward, a young woman named Alice Briggs suddenly doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her skin turned ashen. Her breath escaped in ragged gasps. The crowd froze. "Not here," someone whispered. "Not yet." Alice lifted trembling hands to her throat. I drank from the pump last night." A cold silence fell. Then another man collapsed. Then a child. The sweet scent thickened, becoming syrupy, suffocating. Horses reared. A dog began howling, then fled into the brush. Dr. Avery, summoned by telegraph hours earlier, arrived on horseback just as the square dissolved into hysteria. Adelaide Marsh rode behind him, gloves already in place, face drawn tight with foreknowledge. The mayor rushed to them. "Doctor, we were leaving, we were ready to go, but it's already here." Avery inhaled sharply. The sweetness burned in his lungs. "Evacuation won't save you," he said. "It moves faster than feet, faster than wind. You cannot flee something that rides the very air." "But what can we do?" the mayor cried. Avery surveyed the afflicted, the shimmer clinging to their skin, the fog curling along the ground, the heat radiating from bodies that shivered like winter leaves. He swallowed hard. "You must isolate the sick, quarantine every home, shut the pump, burn anything that carries that scent." "But is it cholera? Typhoid? Yellow fever?" Avery shook his head. "It is all of them," he whispered, "and something more." Adelaide gasped as she noticed the fog near her ankles. It coiled around her boots, warm, thick, almost sentient, before drifting toward the wagons as though curious about their contents. The people watched with widening eyes. "Doctor," Adelaide murmured, "it knows they're leaving." Avery's voice dropped to a grave hush. "It doesn't want them to leave." A scream tore through the crowd as a woman near the gate collapsed, her breath fogging violently. Panic exploded. "Run!" someone shouted. "No, stay together!" another yelled. "Leave the wagons!" Chaos churned in every direction, but the fog moved faster. It slipped between legs, curled up wagon wheels, drifted into open doors, climbed the hems of skirts, and slid beneath collars. The sweetness thickened until even breathing felt like swallowing syrup. The town of Marrow's Crossing, so certain of its safety, realized the truth too late. You cannot outrun air. You cannot outpace a presence that arrives before your footsteps touch the road. And as the first horses bolted wildly into the hills, the fog followed, unhurried, deliberate, almost patient. Marrow's Crossing had tried to flee itself, but the sickness had already packed its bags and gone with them. Dr. Nathaniel Avery had survived more epidemics than most men dared to remember. He had stood at bedsides while cholera stole breath by the mouthful. He had watched typhoid burn through entire families. He had carried infants marked with the crimson bloom of scarlet fever. He had written death certificates until his wrist ached and his ink froze from winter drafts. But never, never had he allowed the sickness to touch him. He believed in cleanliness, in order, in science when others clung to superstition. He boiled his instruments, he avoided contaminated wells, he slept little, ate less, and moved through the city like a man carved from iron and habit. Yet iron rusts, and habit fails, and something in the city's air had learned his name. It began just after dawn. He awoke at his desk in the infirmary, his head resting atop a stack of patient charts. Exhaustion had claimed him at last, though he could not remember closing his eyes. His lamp had burned itself out during the night, leaving only a faint gray light filtering through the foggy windows. He lifted his head and felt it. A chill. Deep. Immediate, cutting through his chest like a blade drawn from ice water. He sat up slowly, swallowing against a dryness in his throat. Nurse Adelaide Marsh entered the room, her gloved hands full of fresh linens. Her expression shifted the moment she saw him. "Doctor, you look pale." He forced a steady breath. "I'm fine." But the breath came with difficulty. It rasped, it trembled, it fogged in the warm room. Adelaide froze. "Your breath." Avery looked down. Indeed, white vapor curled from his lips, dissipating slowly, unnaturally. The room was hot. The stove glowed faintly in one corner. There should have been no fog, none at all. He rose to his feet too quickly, and the world tilted. His vision blurred at the edges, shapes smudging into color, colors dissolving into haze. "Doctor?" Adelaide reached for his arm. He recoiled, not from her, but from fear. "Don't touch me. Not without gloves." She steadied herself. "We must get you into a private ward." "No." He shook his head. "There are too many patients who need that space." Adelaide's voice softened but did not yield. "They need you alive." But Avery was no longer certain he could promise that. Another chill swept through him, this one followed by a wave of heat that flushed his skin and made sweat bead instantly on his brow. He wiped it with a handkerchief and stopped. The cloth shimmered faintly, pearlescent, sweet-smelling. He closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. The sweetness he had detected on every victim, the same sheen he had wiped from their temples, the same scent that haunted the pumps, the schoolroom, the tenements. It now clung to him. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. Then came the cough, a deep, wrenching cough that shook his ribs and left a metallic taste on his tongue. Adelaide stepped closer in alarm. Avery lifted a trembling hand. "Stand back." "But, Adelaide," his voice cracked. "Please." She obeyed, tears welling in her eyes. He staggered to the window, bracing himself against the frame. Outside, the city blurred beneath the morning fog. Gas lamps still burned a sickly shade of blue. Horse-drawn carts moved slowly, as though dragging sorrow behind them. The sweetness in the air seeped through the cracked window pane. He felt it on his skin. He felt it in his blood. He felt it learning him. Memories flickered behind his eyes, patients whispering about warm fog, cold fingers on their throats, voices in their sickness, shadows that moved where shadows shouldn't. And all of it, every strange symptom, had been leading here, to him, to this moment. Adelaide spoke softly. "When did it start?" Avery pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the cold radiating outward. "When I examined the sailor on the Mercy Hill last night. I felt it then. A brush of warmth, a moment of dizziness. I ignored it." "You thought yourself immune," she whispered, not with accusation, but grief. He nodded weakly. "I thought science could shield me." A violent shiver tore through him. He collapsed to his knees. Adelaide rushed forward but stopped herself just inches from touching him. Her gloves quivered with restraint. "Avery," she whispered, voice breaking, "please let me help you." He lifted his head. His breath fogged again, thicker this time. "Adelaide," he managed, "write this down. Whatever this is, it mimics disease. It amplifies it. His voice faltered. "It chooses hosts." She covered her mouth, and then Avery whispered the words that chilled her more deeply than the fog leaving his lips. "It has chosen me." Outside, a gas lamp fizzled, then flared blue. Inside, Dr. Nathaniel Avery bowed his head as the sweetness coiled around him. For the first time, the doctor was the patient, and the city trembled. The city morgue, tucked discreetly behind the municipal courthouse, had always maintained a quiet, clinical dignity. Its stone facade bore no ornament, its iron door no invitation, yet within its cool halls, order once ruled. Bodies arrived, bodies were examined, bodies were catalogued and stored with the measured efficiency of a society clinging to rationality. But reason had grown thin in recent days, and the morgue had become an ark for the dead. On this heavy morning, the air hung low with humidity that curled the edges of official documents and dampened the collars of the morgue attendants. Mr. Elias Hawthorne, longtime custodian and a man whose stoicism could rival marble, pushed the doors open and froze. The receiving room was full, not just crowded, full. Bodies on stretchers lined wall to wall. More lay on the floor, wrapped in sheets hastily torn from infirmary beds. A few had been set upright against the wall, arranged with awkward, apologetic care, because there was simply no space left to lay them flat. Hawthorne swallowed hard. He had worked the morgue during influenza seasons, during factory fires, during cold winters when frostbite claimed the homeless. But he had never witnessed such an influx, and never with such similarity among the dead. Each body bore the same faint pearlescent sheen, the same stillness that looked less like rest and more like arrest. The same sweetness, thick, cloying, unforgettable, oozing faintly from their cooled skin. He pressed a cloth to his nose, but the scent penetrated anyway. Behind him, 2 attendants struggled to maneuver another stretcher through the door. The sheet draped over the body was damp, shimmering. When they passed Hawthorne, one whispered, "Dr. Avery collapsed this morning. They say it's the same as these." Hawthorne closed his eyes. Dr. Avery had been the last bastion of sense in a city slipping into chaos. If he fell... "Where do we put this one?" the attendant asked. Hawthorne looked around helplessly. "There is nowhere." They set the stretcher beside the others, careful not to disturb the remains. The attendants left quickly, neither wanting to linger among the rows of the dead. Hawthorne moved deeper into the morgue, pushing open the steel door that led to the cold chamber. The air inside should have chilled him. Instead, it felt merely damp and wrong. He flicked on a lantern. The shelves were full, every slab occupied, bodies wrapped in sheets, tags hanging from toes, breathless faces that seemed to watch him with unspoken questions. He approached the nearest slab. Miss Isabella Crane, age 24. Cause of death, consumption complicated by anomalous systemic failure. The ink from the physician's note had run, smudged by moisture that should not have existed in a cold room. Hawthorne lifted the sheet slightly. Her skin gleamed faintly, the same sheen he had begun seeing everywhere. A whisper of sweetness curled upward, like the perfume of overripe fruit. He stepped back quickly. Then he heard it. A soft sound, not a voice, not a breath, a shift, like fabric rustling or condensation collecting. He turned sharply. The bodies seemed closer than before. He blinked. Of course they weren't. Fatigue was playing tricks, nothing more. Yet when he passed between 2 slabs, he felt it, a warmth against his sleeve, from a body that should have been cold. He jerked away. The lantern flickered. Its flame bent sideways as though responding to a draft, except the air was still, heavy, unmoving. And then, as he crossed into the next row, he saw something that chilled him more than any corpse ever had. A thin, faint mist drifted above the bodies, barely visible, like steam melting in air. It gathered, curled, pulsed, as though breathing. No, as though listening. Hawthorne's heart hammered. He backed toward the door, but the sweetness thickened, suffocating him. For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the lantern trembling in his grasp. He whispered to himself, "I must leave. I must send word to the board." But when he reached the exit, he heard a soft thud behind him. A slab had trembled, just slightly, barely noticeable. Bodies did not move, not on their own, not unless... He refused the thought. Bursting into the hallway, he gulped the musty air as though it were salvation. Attendants rushed past him, frantic. "Hawthorne!" one shouted. "More are coming. 20 from the river district." 20? He whispered. "It's only noon." Hawthorne looked back at the morgue door. The sweetness seeped beneath it like vapor. "We cannot take more," he murmured, voice hollow. "There is no more room." Yet the sickness did not ask for room. It took what it wanted, and the morgue, once a place of stillness, had begun to feel crowded, watched, alive. The apothecaries of the city had always been sanctuaries of illusion, small temples where glass vials sparkled like jewels, where colored liquids promised vitality, and where powders with charming names whispered of rejuvenation. In quieter years, the scent of lavender tincture and menthol salve was enough to comfort anxious hearts. Mothers came seeking sleep tonics for fussing children, clerks purchased headache drafts after long hours beneath gaslight, and the elderly sought elixirs that claimed to restore vigor to tired bones. But now, with sickness stalking the streets like a familiar predator, the pharmacies had become crowded shrines of desperation. On Mulberry Street, Mr. Thaddeus Griggs's apothecary overflowed from the moment he unlocked the door. Customers pressed shoulder to shoulder, voices trembling, hands clutching coins or bills or whatever could be bartered for a vial of hope. The scent inside was overwhelming, a fog of camphor, carbolic acid, rosewater, and fear. "Please, Mr. Griggs," a woman begged, thrusting forward her coin purse. "My children are fevered. I need another bottle of quinine." "We're out," Griggs replied, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "Have been since dawn. I can give you peppermint oil or a mustard plaster, nothing more." "What am I to do with peppermint oil?" she cried, voice cracking with despair. Before he could answer, the door burst open, letting in a wave of humid July air and the faint sickly sweetness that now haunted every street. A man stumbled inside, coughing so violently that his knees buckled. 2 strangers caught him before he collapsed to the floor. "Get him water!" someone shouted. "No, no water!" another woman shrieked. "The pumps are poisoned. You'll kill him." Griggs's face blanched. He reached beneath the counter for a vial of smelling salts, uncorked it swiftly, and pressed it beneath the man's nose. The man jolted awake with a gasp, his breath fogging as though he stood in winter's shadow, not summer's furnace. Gasps rippled through the shop. "His breath," someone whispered. "It's like the stories from the tenements." Griggs swallowed hard. Everyone stepped back. "Give him air." But the air itself was the problem. Even he could smell the sweetness, thicker now, crawling along the shelves as though seeking purchase among the tinctures. His fingers brushed a glass bottle and recoiled. The bottle was warm. Too warm. He lifted it, horrified to find a faint shimmer blooming across its surface, pearl-like and sinister. "Mr. Griggs?" a timid voice spoke from behind. It was his apprentice, Clara, a girl scarcely 17, pale as the orchids that sometimes wilted in the shop window. She held out a jar of disinfectant. "The powders near the window. They're clumping." "Impossible," he muttered. But when he inspected them, he saw she was right. Dried herbs that should have remained. Crisp had softened and fused together as though exposed to steam. And the powders? They shimmered. A sheen coated them like frost, except it was warm to the touch. "Clara," he whispered, "fetch the lantern." But before she could move, a commotion erupted near the cough syrup shelves. A young man, no more than 20, had opened a bottle of laudanum with trembling hands. His fingers slipped, dropping the glass. It shattered across the floor, sending shards glittering across the tiles. From the puddle of spilled laudanum, a thin wisp of vapor rose, warm, sweet, curling upward in a slow, deliberate spiral. The crowd backed away in unison. "It's in the medicines, too," Clara whispered, horrified. "No," Griggs breathed, though he already knew it was true. The sickness had learned to travel, through water, through air, through breath, through rooms and walls, and now, through remedies. People began shouting. Give us something, anything. You must have more quinine. Sell us ether, chloroform, carbolic. Please, my husband is dying." Hands reached for bottles, vials, jars, knocking them from shelves in their frenzy. Glass shattered, releasing more of the unnatural sweetness. The fog thickened, drifting along the aisles with a quiet hunger. Griggs slammed his palms against the counter. "Stop!" The room fell silent. He took a breath and felt it burn cold. His voice shook. "I have no cures, no powders, no elixirs, no tinctures that can touch this." A murmur of despair rippled through the crowd. Clara's eyes widened with sudden terror. "Mr. Griggs, look!" He turned. The blue flames of the gas lamps outside reflected through the window, tinting the shop in a spectral glow. And in that glow, he saw it clearly for the first time. A haze, thin, pearlescent, drifting above the shelves, coiling between the bottles, brushing past the customers as gently as a hand through silk. It moved, not randomly, not aimlessly, but watching, studying, choosing. Griggs staggered backward, knocking over a jar of eucalyptus oil. "Everyone out," he whispered, then louder, "Out! Leave the shop!" They fled, tripping over crates, slipping on spilled medicines, bursting into the street where the sweetness followed them as surely as breath. Clara remained rooted in terror. "What will we do?" Griggs looked at the shimmering air above the counter. He spoke the truth he had feared since the first patient collapsed. "We are selling hope by the drop," he whispered, "but death has learned to drink it." The city hospital had long been a fortress of light, its corridors illuminated through every hour of the night so that no patient, no nurse, no doctor ever had to stand alone with illness in the dark. Lamps burned steadily from dusk until dawn, fed by nurses who trimmed wicks with ritualistic precision, as though the glow itself kept despair at bay. But now the lamps did not merely burn. They blazed. Every wick burned higher than it should, flames tall and strangely blue-tinted, casting the ward in a ghostly luminance that seemed to vibrate with tension. The nurses whispered that the lamps fought the darkness, not metaphorically but literally, wrestling back something creeping from the shadows. Nurse Adelaide Marsh moved down the corridor, gloved hands steady, though exhaustion weighted her footsteps. The air felt thick, syrupy, humming faintly as though charged with invisible currents. Behind each door, patients groaned, muttered, or whimpered through fevers that broke natural laws. The lamps hissed softly above her. They had not dimmed in 3 days. She stepped into the long ward where 30 beds stretched outward in 2 rigid rows. The room was oppressively warm despite the open windows. The sweetness hung low over the beds, hovering inches above the patients' bodies like an invisible canopy. Adelaide paused at bed 9. Henry, the boy from the train. His small face had grown gaunt, shadowed beneath the cheekbones. His breath rose in short clouds, fogging gently despite the heat. As she checked his pulse, he stirred. "Nurse," he whispered, "don't let the lamps go out." "They won't," she murmured, smoothing his hair. "We're watching them carefully." "No," his eyelids fluttered. "Not for the light, for the shadows." Adelaide stiffened. "The shadows?" Henry pointed weakly toward the ceiling rafters. "There. They move when the lamps dip. I saw them. They don't like the light." Adelaide forced a gentle smile she did not feel. "You're fevered. Rest." But as she turned, she noticed something that made her blood chill. 3 lamps flickered simultaneously, just for an instant, barely perceptible, and the shadows on the far wall stretched, elongated, slithered upward before snapping back into place. Her breath caught. Before she could investigate, Dr. Avery's assistant, Thomas Keene, rushed into the ward, his face pale and sheened with sweat. "Adelaide," he gasped, "we've had 6 new collapses in the lower hall, 2 with diphtheria symptoms, 1 cholera, 1 scarlet rash. They developed within minutes." Minutes. Disease did not behave this way, unless it was no longer disease. Adelaide swallowed hard. "And the doctor?" Keene hesitated, eyes falling. "He remains in isolation. He asked for no visitors. He's writing notes between fits of fever." Her throat tightened. Dr. Avery, her steady constant, struck down like the rest. She steadied herself, then followed Keene to the lower hall. The scene that unfolded there resembled a battlefield tent. patients spread on cots and blankets, their bodies trembling violently, their breath fogging despite the stifling heat. The lamps burned fiercely overhead, their flames reaching almost unnaturally high. A scarlet fever girl muttered deliriously, "It's warm in the corners, warm and moving." A cholera victim rasped, "Don't let it touch the water." A diphtheria patient clutched his throat, eyes bulging. "It's learning our breath." Adelaide knelt beside him. What is learning? His gaze fixed on the ceiling, on the shadows, on the places where the lamplight struggled to reach. He whispered. "It warms the air, then cools it, until we follow." Adelaide felt the sweetness press around her like fog. Keen's voice trembled. "Should we extinguish the lamps?" "No," Adelaide cried, startling him. "If the light goes, so does whatever restrains that." Keen glanced toward the rafters, where the darkness pooled unnaturally thick. He shivered. One of the attendants entered abruptly. "Nurse Marsh, come quickly. The lamps in the West Ward are dimming." Adelaide sprinted down the corridor, heart strangled by dread. As she reached the West Ward, she saw it. Half the lamps flickered erratically, sputtering as though losing air. The shadows below them stirred like restless animals, twisting, coiling, reaching upward. A patient screamed, another began convulsing. The sweetness thickened, an oppressive, suffocating wave. Adelaide seized a lantern from the wall, lifting it high. The flame inside flared bright blue and steady. At once the nearest shadow recoiled, shrinking back toward the corner like mist drawn away by a sudden wind. She understood. "It hates the light," she whispered, or feared it, or could not inhabit it. And the lamps were the only thing standing between the patients and whatever hunted the city through breath and fever. She turned to the terrified attendants. "Trim every wick," she commanded. "Open the gas valves fully. We keep the lamps burning, no matter the cost." For the first time since the outbreak began, Adelaide Marsh did not fear the fever. She feared what lurked behind it, and as the lamps blazed brighter, she dared a glance toward the rafters. The shadows slipped away, not defeated, but retreating, waiting, watching. The offices of the Evening Clarion had always thrived on clatter. Type bars striking paper with crisp efficiency, editors barking revisions across crowded desks, reporters rushing in and out with ink-stained sleeves and half-written stories clenched between their teeth. News, after all, was the city's second heartbeat, and the Clarion prided itself on capturing every tremor. But now there was no clatter, only whispers, only dread. A thick haze of humidity clung to the newsroom. Papers curled at the edges, inkpots sweated, and even the great brass ceiling fan, usually spinning with relentless force, turned slowly, as though reluctant to stir the sweet, heavy air drifting through the building. Mr. Douglas Harrow, senior editor for nearly 20 years, stood at the center of the silent room with a telegram in his trembling hand. His face had the pallor of melted tallow. Around him, junior reporters watched like anxious birds waiting for him to speak. He read the telegram again, though he already knew its every word. Unprecedented mortality. Stop lamps burn. Blue stop fog. Warm to touch. Stop diseases. Acting against reason. Stop city. Unraveling. Stop silence. No longer. Safety. Stop. Harrow set the paper down and removed his spectacles. "It's from Dr. Avery," he murmured. A hush gripped the room. "But Dr. Avery is ill," whispered Ruth Collins, the newest reporter. "They telegraphed that he collapsed yesterday. How could he still be sending messages?" Harrow exhaled shakily. "Because he knows something we do not." Another telegram sat on the desk, its edges damp, the ink smudged by a sheen that should not have existed indoors. "The sweetness is warning. Stop, the air is carrying more than disease. Stop, prepare, public before it is too late." Stop, the entire newsroom had read it. No one wanted to print it. To publish would mean panic, riots, mass flights, the collapse of every fragile illusion holding the city together. And yet, withholding it felt like a betrayal of their duty. Another reporter stepped forward. "Sir, the morgue sent notice this morning. They've run out of space." A murmur rose. "And the pharmacies, and the schoolrooms, and the orphanages, and the ships." The weight of every whispered catastrophe hung heavily between them. Harrow nodded once, slowly, decisively. We break the silence. The moment he said it, the typewriter seemed to breathe again. He seized a blank sheet and fed it into his machine. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling. Ruth approached cautiously. "What shall be our headline?" Harrow swallowed. The lamps in the newsroom flickered, blue at their bases, golden at their tips. Outside the frosted window, he swore he saw the fog shift, curling upward as though eavesdropping. He placed his fingers on the keys. "The air is turning against us. No too dramatic. Mysterious illness. Grip City too mild, too naive." His hand shook. He typed, "Instead, what is moving through our breath?" And the words struck him with terrible clarity. Ruth gasped softly. "Sir, do you believe something else is inside the sickness?" Harrow did not answer. He didn't need to. In the corner of the newsroom, a discarded cup of water shimmered faintly. A thin vapor curled from its surface, warm, sweet, alive. Ruth followed Harrow's gaze and whispered, "It's here too." He forced himself back to the typewriter. "Ruth, fetch the press foreman. Tell him we print immediately, and warn the boys not to breathe too deeply." "But sir, if this causes panic, then panic may be the only thing that keeps people inside their homes tonight." The presses roared to life, a sound that once symbolized progress but now reverberated with dread. Inked letters imprinted warnings onto thousands of newspapers that would fly across the city before dusk. As the first papers rolled out, Harrow lifted one with trembling hands. The Evening Clarion. Special edition. The air is no longer safe. Just then, the nearest lamp dimmed, only for a second, but the shadows beneath the desks stretched long, reaching toward Harrow's shoes like fingers tasting the light. Ruth grabbed his arm. "Mr. Harrow, look." The fog outside pressed against the window pane, shimmering with a pearlescent sheen, watching, waiting, learning. The presses continued thundering as Harrow whispered, "We have broken our silence." And somewhere, in the sweetness gathering along the windowsill, something shifted in response, as though the silence had broken it as well. For decades, the orphan trains had been symbols of mercy, wood and iron lifelines carrying abandoned children from overcrowded cities to distant farms where families waited to give them new beginnings. At least, that was the story printed on posters and spoken from church pulpits. The truth was more complex, more fragile, more threaded with sorrow than hope, but still the trains ran, puffing white steam into the sky like promises released into the air. But now the steam was not white, and the promises had soured. On this sweltering July morning, the children of the St. Hildegard Home for Foundlings stood in a neat line beside the platform, clutching small burlap sacks filled with their meager possessions. Some held dolls stitched from scraps, others held nothing at all. Their faces were a patchwork of weariness, resignation, and a thin, brittle hope. Sister Magdalene, their supervisor, moved along the row with hurried prayers, pressing a kiss to the forehead of each child. Her hands trembled, partly from the unbearable heat, partly from the faint sweetness that threaded through the air like a ribbon of perfume gone rotten. The station master approached. "Sister," he murmured, "best to hurry. Rumors are spreading. Folks say the sickness travels where the crowds gather." Sister Magdalene nodded, though fear pressed into her ribs like a fist. "The farms will be safer," she whispered, mostly to convince herself. "Fresh air, clean water, open fields, far from the city." But her words faltered as a gust of wind swept across the platform, carrying the sweetness with it, warm, unnervingly warm. Little Samuel Carter tugged at her sleeve. "Sister, the air tastes funny." She forced a smile. "It's only the coal smoke, my dear." Except coal smoke was never sweet. The whistle blew, a long, mournful cry. The orphan train lurched forward a few feet, readying itself. Its black engine glistened beneath the sun, but the steam rising from it shimmered oddly, rippling with a pearlescent sheen. Sister Magdalene stiffened. "Father in heaven," she whispered, "not here, not the children." The boarding began. One by one, the children climbed the steps into the train car, their small shoes clacking against the metal. But the moment Samuel entered, he paused. His breath fogged briefly in the hot air before him, a tiny, ghostly puff. "Did you see that?" he asked. Sister Magdalene's throat tightened. "Inside, Samuel, quickly." But inside was worse. The moment she stepped into the car, she felt it, warmth clinging to the air like damp wool. The sweetness thickened, folding around the seats and luggage racks. Shadows trembled at the edges of the windows. A faint shimmer drifted above the aisle, curling lazily from seat to seat. It was here. Already here. She turned to the children. "Stay in your seats, hands folded. Do not touch anything without my instruction." But 4-year-old Millie Hayes was already rubbing. Her eyes, her cheeks were flushed, a rash, just a hint of rose, spread along her neck. "No," Sister Magdalene breathed, "not her too." A young volunteer, Lewis Turner, burst into the car. "Sister, we must leave now. The station master insists. Another train is coming in with sick passengers." She hesitated. She should disembark the children. She should run. She should shelter them in the open air. But the open air carried the sweetness. Everywhere carried the sweetness. The train jolted forward. Sister Magdalene realized it too late. They were trapped inside a moving capsule of warm, infected breath. As the train gathered speed, the windows rattled. Millie whimpered. Samuel leaned toward the aisle, eyes wide with terror. "Sister," he whispered, "something's walking in the air." Her blood iced. "What do you mean?" He pointed slowly, trembling, toward the shimmering fog above the seats. "It's warm, and it's looking at us." The train plunged deeper into the countryside, carrying the children away from the city, but not from the sickness. Because the sickness had boarded with them. And as the orphan train disappeared beyond the horizon, its trail of steam shimmered faintly blue in the sunlight. Not a sign of escape, but a signal. Something had decided the children would not be left behind. Not today. Not ever. Councilman Horatio Pembroke prided himself on two things: his immaculate waistcoats and his immaculate control of public opinion. Each morning, he strode into City Hall with the confidence of a man who believed himself architect of order in a city built on chaos. He greeted clerks by name, charmed reporters with vague promises, and assured nervous constituents that the rumors sweeping through the streets were nothing more than the usual summer exaggerations. But this morning, even his polished boots could not mask the tremor in his stride. The air inside City Hall felt warmer than usual, thick, syrupy, humming faintly. The lamps burned blue at their bases, though every attendant insisted the gas lines had been inspected twice. Papers curled on desks. The faint sweetness, now as familiar as dread, drifted through the corridors like a quiet accusation. Pembroke ignored it. He had bigger concerns. "What do you mean another district has fallen ill?" he snapped at his secretary as he slapped a stack of reports onto his mahogany desk. The secretary swallowed. "Sir, the 5th Ward is, well, the doctors say it can no longer be contained, and now the 6th is showing." "Enough." Pembroke slammed his palm against the desk. "Do you want to cause panic? Do you want riots, breadlines, looting? The press will devour us if we admit we've lost control." The secretary hesitated. "Sir, the press already knows. The Clarion printed an emergency edition last night." Pembroke froze. He had counted on their silence, counted on his influence, counted on the city's long habit of swallowing truths too large to face. But truths have a way of slipping through cracks, especially when carried on air. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Lydia Corbin, the last physician willing to visit City Hall, entered with a face pale from sleepless nights. Her gloves trembled as she removed them. "Councilman," she said without preamble, "you must declare a citywide quarantine. Close the markets, shut the rail lines, seal the river docks. This is no longer multiple diseases, it is a single force manipulating them." Pembroke scoffed. "Manipulating? Doctor, please, science does not allow for such fantastical thinking." Corbin stepped forward, eyes fierce. "Science also does not allow cholera, smallpox, scarlet fever, typhoid, diphtheria, and consumption to accelerate in unison. Nor does it allow breath to fog in July, nor sweetness to rise from water, nor fog to move like a living thing. Fog does not move like a... This one does." The tremor in her voice silenced him. She placed a sealed vial on his desk. Inside, a pale residue shimmered, pearlescent, pulsing faintly. "This," she whispered, "was collected from the skin of a patient who died 20 minutes after onset. I warmed it. It cooled. I cooled it. It warmed. Councilman, it responds." Pembroke recoiled. "Take it away." "I've shown it to the Board of Health," Corbin continued. "They want the city shut down immediately." He slammed his fist on the desk. "I will not destroy our economy because of fog and hysteria." Corbin's expression hardened. "You will destroy the city if you do nothing." Pembroke turned away, striding toward the tall window that overlooked the square. Outside, the lamps flickered blue. People hurried past with cloths pressed over their mouths. A cart rattled by carrying 3 bodies beneath tarps. He straightened his waistcoat, regaining that familiar political poise. "We issue a statement downplaying the crisis. We reassure the public it is contained. We emphasize confidence, calm, order." Corbin stared at him in disbelief. "Containment is a lie. People are dying by the hour." "They die every summer," Pembroke replied coldly. "This is no different." A gust of wind pressed against the window, warm, sweet, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. Corbin's eyes widened. "Councilman, look." A thin mist curled along the glass, like breath from something standing on the other side. Pembroke stepped back. The sweetness grew stronger. The mist pulsed, as though listening, as though waiting for a decision. Corbin whispered, "It wants silence. It thrives in it. Every hour you delay." But Pembroke cut her off. "Send the press release." She stared at him with something deeper than anger, disappointment, resignation, fear. "You will regret this," she said quietly. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, but as she left, the mist thinned, not retreating, not disappearing, but slipping through the window frame like smoke through a crack. Pembroke inhaled. The sweetness filled his lungs. He staggered, gripped the desk, coughed once, deep, rattling. He froze, his breath fogged in front of him. Corbin, outside the door, heard the sound and turned sharply. Inside, Pembroke stared at his own breath with dawning horror. For the first time, the politician who hid the outbreak understood. The outbreak no longer needed hiding. It was in the room with him, and it had been waiting for him to speak. The mansions of Hawthorne Heights shimmered beneath the summer sun like polished ivory. Broad verandas trimmed with iron fretwork, fountains murmuring in manicured courtyards, and windows glinting as though the glass itself possessed a higher pedigree. Carriages clattered along clean brick roads, and the scent of roses drifted from gardens trimmed with geometric perfection. To the wealthy families who lived here, the chaos gripping the rest of the city felt distant, like a rumor whispered from faraway slums. Disease, after all, was something for the poor, something that seeped through cracked tenement walls, not French doors framed by silk curtains. They had their own water pumps, untainted by the city's aging pipes. They had physicians who made private house calls. They had confidence, polished, lacquered, and utterly misplaced. Mrs. Adelaide Pembroke, wife of Councilman Horatio Pembroke, stood on her veranda in a gown the color of champagne, her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist. She watched the distant city skyline with a faint, troubled frown. "Horatio has been gone since dawn," she murmured to her maid. "The poor dear must be exhausted dealing with all those exaggerated rumors." Her maid hesitated. "Madam, the papers say it is far more than rumor." "That rag? The Clarion?" Mrs. Pembroke scoffed. "They thrive on panic. No respectable publication would print such nonsense." But even as she spoke, the air shifted. A breeze fluttered through the garden, carrying the faint sweetness that had begun to haunt the entire city. It glided through rose petals, coiled between marble columns, and brushed softly against Mrs. Pembroke's cheek. She shivered. The maid stepped back, fear flickering in her eyes. "Madam, your breath." Mrs. Pembroke exhaled. For a moment, a brief, terrible moment, her breath fogged in the shimmering air. "That must be the heat," she said quickly. "Fetch me a fan." But when the maid returned, Mrs. Pembroke had collapsed against the balustrade, one hand pressed to her throat. Inside the mansion, chaos blossomed like disease itself. The Pembroke's daughter, Eleanor, only 9 years old, came stumbling down the stairs clutching her doll. "Mama! Mama, the walls are warm!" The maid caught her. "What do you mean, dear?" Eleanor pointed toward the upper hall. The air moved, like it was walking. The maid's blood chilled. "Where are your brothers?" Before Eleanor could answer, a scream erupted from the parlor. The butler, Mr. Graves, stumbled into the corridor. His usually impeccable posture collapsed into a hunched, trembling stance. Sweat drenched his collar, his breath clouded with every exhale. "Get out," he rasped. "The warmth, it's in the walls." The maid dragged Eleanor toward the entrance, but the moment she opened the front door, the sweetness intensified, thick as syrup, hot as breath against the neck. A shimmering. Haze hovered above the courtyard fountain, swirling with slow deliberation. The maid froze. Eleanor whimpered. "It followed us." Meanwhile, in the mansion across the street, another wealthy family was gathered in their drawing room, reading Councilman Pembroke's reassuring press release aloud over afternoon tea. "See," the father declared, "the city is taking every precaution. We have nothing to fear." But the chandeliers trembled. The air above the tea tray shimmered faintly. The flames in the sconces stretched tall, blue-tipped, quivering with unease. The father paused mid-sentence. What in heaven? He never finished. The youngest child collapsed first, teacup shattering beside her, steam curling upward from her fallen body. The governess screamed. The mother fainted. And the air, warm, heavy, sweet, filled the drawing room, moving across the carpet as though searching for something. Searching, learning, choosing. Across Hawthorne Heights, servants fled screaming through manicured streets. Curtains billowed from open windows. Horses reared and bolted down the lanes. Blue flames flickered behind every pane of glass. And one thing became horribly clear. The wealthy district had never been safe. It had merely been silent. Disease does not respect privilege. And this, whatever it was, did not respect walls, wealth, or names printed on brass plaques. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, a shimmering fog gathered above Hawthorne Heights, pulsing gently as though satisfied with its new reach. The illusion of safety had died, and the sickness, patient, deliberate, relentless, had finally climbed the hill. The city had always trusted its water. Pumps clattered in every square, their iron handles worn smooth by thousands of hands. Wells bore names that sounded almost affectionate. Mother's Drop, St. Bridget's Spring, the Old Lion's Mouth, historic guardians of public life. Even the river, though often murky, carried barges and ferry boats with the reliability of a vein pulsing beneath the city's heart. But trust, like water, can turn. On the morning the city's water betrayed its people, a humid fog rolled low across the streets, clinging to the gutters and swirling around the pumps as though it possessed intention. Mrs. Eloise Hartley, a laundress with 2 children and joints worn from boiling linens in lime soap, approached the Old Lion's Mouth pump just after dawn. She carried 2 tin pails and the memory of a restless night filled with strange dreams, the kind in which the air felt thick and watchful. As she lowered her first pail beneath the spout, she paused. The pump water shimmered, not with the sparkle of sunlight, nor with the glimmer of ice, but with something warm, an unnatural luminescence pooling at the bottom like melted pearl. "Just the morning light," she whispered to herself. She pulled the handle. The water poured out in a smooth, steady stream, then slowed, then thickened, turning syrupy in appearance though still liquid to the touch. The sweetness drifted upward, gentle but unmistakable. Her heart lurched. She stepped back, and the water in the pail shifted. Its surface rose in a slow, unnatural swell, as if something beneath were breathing. The shimmer rippled outward, touching the rim, clinging to it like tiny fingers. Mrs. Hartley dropped the pail. Water splashed across the cobblestones, and where it landed, a faint fog curled upward, warm, sweet, and alive. Within an hour, half the city had gathered around various pumps, all reporting the same impossible signs: water running warm, water glowing faintly in the shade, water rising in pails without movement, water breathing. The Board of Health responded with disbelief until witness after witness repeated the same details, their trembling voices blending into a chorus of dread. By late morning, Dr. Lydia Corbin herself arrived at the central pump in St. Florian Square. Her gloves were already slick with sweat. Her lantern flickered blue. Adelaide Marsh accompanied her, though her face showed the exhaustion of 10 sleepless nights and the grief of watching Dr. Avery decline. Corbin knelt beside the pump's drainage channel. The water inside did not sit still. It pulsed, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable, like something learning to mimic the heartbeat of its onlookers. Adelaide whispered, "It's moving by intention." Corbin nodded grimly. "It is no longer contaminating the water. It is inhabiting it." A crowd gathered behind them, mothers, laborers, factory boys, servants, even a pair of trembling policemen. "What is it? Want, doctor?" someone cried. Corbin hesitated. The water answered for her. The pump gave a low, unnatural groan. Not metal grinding, not pipes rattling, but something like a voice moving through hollow iron. Then the water rose, straight up from the spout, shimmering in a narrow column, defying gravity, quivering like a candle flame caught in breath. The crowd screamed. Adelaide stumbled backward. Corbin leapt up, dragging a child with her. The rising water column twisted, bending toward the people, reaching. A single drop separated from the rest and landed on a man's sleeve. He swiped at it, then froze. The sheen spread from the drop across his coat like frost racing over glass. His breath fogged, his knees buckled. Adelaide and Corbin pulled him away just as the water column collapsed back into the pump with a violent splash, sending warm mist billowing upward. People fled in every direction. The mist followed. It seeped downward into gutters, upward into windows, sideways into alleyways. It caught on the hems of dresses, the brims of hats, the edges of handcarts. It clung as intimately as breath. By early afternoon, the city's engineers had shut down the primary valves feeding the pumps, but the water did not stop flowing. It forced itself upward through cracks, through burst seams, through drains that had not seen moisture in years. Adelaide stared at the runoff pooling near her boots. "It wants to spread," she said quietly. Corbin shook her head. "No, it wants to belong." Another scream tore through the square as the water surged from a storm grate. People scattered. Corbin seized Adelaide's arm. "We must warn the city. Nothing that flows can be trusted. Not pipes, not wells, not rivers, not pumps." She paused. "Not even rain." As if in reply, a drop of shimmering moisture fell from the sky and landed on her sleeve. Warm, sweet, alive. The water had turned, and it had chosen its moment with perfect, terrible timing. The fog had always been a familiar companion to the city, rolling in from the river at dawn, curling around lampposts at night, softening the gaslight until the streets resembled a half-remembered dream. Children played shadow games in it, lovers walked beneath it, policemen cursed it for swallowing their lantern beams whole. But the fog that descended on the city this evening was not familiar, and it did not drift. It chose. It arrived just as the sun dipped below the smokestacks, sliding over the rooftops like a silken cloth unfurled by unseen hands. Unlike the usual gray mist, this fog shimmered faintly, tinged with iridescent hues, pearl, rose, pale blue, like the shifting surface of diseased water under a lantern flame. At first, people admired it. By nightfall, no one left to admire it remained alive. It began in the Millstone district. Factory whistles had just released the workers for the evening. Hundreds poured into the streets, wiping soot from their faces, loosening collars, eager for supper and the brief comfort of rest. But as they walked, the air grew suddenly warm. "Storm coming," someone muttered. Another shook his head. "Not warm, sweet." Men and women paused mid-step. The sweetness thickened, filling their noses, coating their tongues, lingering in the throat like syrup. Children coughed, fanning their hands in front of their faces. Then the fog poured down the hill. Not drifted, poured, as if spilling from a great overturned basin. It rolled through the streets with alarming speed, filling alleys and open spaces alike. Gas lamps flickered blue. Windows fogged instantly from the outside. Doors slammed shut. A seamstress screamed as the fog brushed her skirts and left a faint shimmer crawling up the fabric. "Run!" a foreman shouted. But the fog moved faster. Within seconds, it swallowed the nearest workers. Their screams cut short. Thuds echoed, bodies hitting cobblestone. Those who witnessed even a glimpse swore the fog tightened around them like a living thing. Inside the district's tavern, patrons barricaded the doors and windows. The fog pressed against the glass, swirling, testing, pulsing with quiet curiosity. "What is it doing?" someone whispered. An older man replied, voice trembling, "Learning the shape of the room." The fog suddenly surged upward, covering the windows from top to bottom. The glass rattled, the lamps flared tall. Then, silence. Not a breath, not a movement, not a sound from outside. A young barmaid crept toward the door. Maybe it's gone, but when she cracked it open, the fog streamed inside as though it had been waiting. Her scream dissolved into a gurgle. Within moments, the tavern was consumed, its lamps burning blue against the suffocating sweetness. By midnight, the fog had expanded into the surrounding neighborhoods. Coroners would later write that it behaved like a predator, isolating districts, closing escape routes, leaving no witnesses. But coroners rarely recorded the way the fog moved, folding, unfurling, pulsing, as though breathing. In the central hospital, Adelaide Marsh watched it advance through the courtyard. "Close the shutters," she shouted. Attendants rushed to secure the iron latches, but the fog seeped through cracks in the stone, drifting along floors, rising up staircase wells, brushing the hems of skirts with tender, deadly attention. Adelaide covered her mouth with a cloth soaked in disinfectant. "It's targeting the breath," she whispered. Dr. Corbin stared out the window, horror hollowing her face. "It no longer needs water. It no longer needs contact. It rides the air now." A sudden crash echoed from the west wing. The fog had shattered a window. Screams followed, raw, short-lived. Corbin seized Adelaide's arm. "We cannot save this building. We must escape before it reaches the wards." "But the patients, anyone it reaches," Corbin said, voice trembling, "dies before they can take a second breath." The fog pressed harder against the walls. Lamps flared blue and long. The sweetness grew overwhelming, suffocating, almost perfumed. A final scream rose from the courtyard, cut off abruptly. The fog curled beneath the door. Adelaide whispered, "No one survives this." Corbin nodded. Outside, the shimmering fog expanded across the city, reaching street after street, block after block, leaving only silence in its wake. The drifting fog had stopped drifting. Now it hunted. Morning should have brought relief. Even after nights of thunder or fire or riot, dawn usually arrived with a pale, forgiving light that coaxed the city back into motion. Bakers lit their ovens, streetcar bells chimed, milk carts rattled along cobblestones. Life, bruised but persistent, always managed to resume. But on this morning, the sun rose over a city holding its breath. It rose over empty streets, over lamps that had burned themselves to stubs, over sheets pinned to windows as makeshift barriers. It rose over riverbanks coated in a pearlescent residue. It rose over rooftops dusted with a faint, shimmering glaze that caught the light like frost, yet felt warm to the touch. No birds sang, no dogs barked, no carts rolled. The city was not waking. It was waiting. Inside the infirmary, Nurse Adelaide Marsh pressed her back against the wall, fighting sleep. Her lantern flickered, casting ghostly halos across the floor. For hours, she and Dr. Lydia Corbin had barricaded themselves behind thick wooden doors while the drifting fog ravaged the courtyard outside. They had listened to patients' screams collapse into silence. They had smelled the sweetness thickening until the very air felt edible, choking. Only near dawn had the fog thinned, retreating the way a predator withdraws once sated. Corbin paced the room now, her gloves stained from the attempts to save the last few patients still breathing. She stopped suddenly, head tilted. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Adelaide strained her ears. Silence. Not the quiet of rest, but the hollow absence of life. A silence so deep it pressed against the eardrums like pressure from the sea. "It's too still," Adelaide murmured. Corbin nodded. "The fog devoured whole districts. It moves with intent. And now?" She gestured toward the cracked window pane. "Now it's waiting to see what we do next." Adelaide's hand trembled. "We cannot remain inside forever." "No," Corbin said quietly. "We cannot." She approached the window, wiping away smeared condensation. Outside, the courtyard lay deserted, but the stones glistened with a faint iridescent sheen, like the sheen of a lung struggling to breathe. "Doctor," Adelaide whispered, "is the city dying?" Corbin did not answer. Instead, she gestured for Adelaide to help her push open the window. The hinges groaned. A thin ribbon of morning air slipped through, warm, sweet, dangerously inviting. Adelaide flinched, but Corbin leaned forward. "Look." Along the far wall, vines of the fog's residue clung to the bricks, frozen in place as though petrified by the sunrise. A few tendrils twitched, curling inward like dying leaves. "It weakens in daylight," Corbin murmured. "Then we can fight it," Adelaide breathed. Corbin's expression darkened. "Perhaps. But the daylight itself is fragile, and the fog grows bolder with each night." A sudden sound shattered the stillness, a distant crash. Then a moan, then a voice calling for help. Adelaide's heart surged. "Survivors!" She ran to unbolt the infirmary door. Corbin followed, though hesitation stiffened her posture. The hallway beyond lay dim and warm. Sheets and overturned carts littered the floor. The sweet scent lingered thickly, but not overpoweringly. Adelaide stepped forward cautiously. From the stairwell, a young man stumbled into view, face gaunt, eyes haunted. His shirt was torn as if he had fought shadows. "Please," he rasped, "is anyone alive?" Adelaide rushed to his side. "We're here. Sit. Breathe slowly." He clutched her wrist with desperate strength. "The fog. It spoke." Corbin stiffened. "Spoke?" "Not words," he gasped, "but meaning, like it wanted something, like it wanted us to want it." Adelaide felt a chill slither down her spine. What did it want? His answer came barely as a whisper. "To breathe through us." Corbin swallowed hard. "It's assimilating, moving from air to water to bodies, using us as vessels." The young man nodded weakly. "It left just before dawn, but it will return. When the lamps burn low again, it will come to finish what it started." Adelaide touched his shoulder. "We will protect you. We will protect whoever is left." But even as she said it, the sweetness in the hallway wavered, like a barely perceptible sigh. The fog had not vanished. It had only loosened its grip. Daylight had bought the city a single trembling breath. And now it was up to the survivors to decide how to use it. Corbin stood tall, gathering her medical satchel. "Today, the city tries to breathe again. We find survivors. We warn them. We prepare for nightfall." Adelaide nodded, lantern in hand. Behind them, the sunlight reflected off the iridescent residue on the courtyard stones. It glittered beautifully, like the surface of something alive pretending to sleep. The harbor had always been a place of movement, sails unfurling like wings, ferry whistles echoing across the water, gulls shrieking over crates and nets. But now the harbor looked like a painting left too long in the sun, colors bleached, edges wavering, life worn thin. In the early morning haze, only 3 ferries remained moored at the docks. 3 ferries, intended for hundreds. 3 ferries, too few for a city of thousands desperate to escape. The water lapped against the pilings with a soft, rhythmic insistence, as though urging the vessels to depart. Yet the water itself shimmered faintly, holding that familiar, unnatural warmth. No one trusted it. No one dared touch it. But fear had grown so large that people were now willing to gamble with the very substance that had begun to turn against them. A crowd gathered at the docks, faces pale, clothes hastily thrown over nightclothes, bundles clutched to chests. Children whimpered. Men shouted at no one in particular. Women prayed under their breath. Officer Samuel Whitaker, broad-shouldered, stubbled, and exhausted from 3 sleepless nights, attempted to keep order. "One line! Families first! Sick to the rear! Please, please do not push!" The crowd pushed anyway. Fear has no patience for instructions. A woman stumbled forward, hand pressed to her throat. Her breath fogged. Whitaker recoiled. "Ma'am, you cannot board. We have to screen anyone showing—" "Please!" she cried, collapsing against him. "I don't want to die here!" Her tears landed on his sleeve and sizzled faintly. Whitaker flinched. The sweetness curled upward. The crowd screamed. 2 sailors grabbed the woman and gently moved her aside, though their hands trembled. Everyone had heard the stories. Those touched by the sweetness did not remain themselves for long. On the far end of the pier, Dr. Lydia Corbin and Nurse Adelaide Marsh arrived with a trio of survivors they had rescued that morning. The sun glinted off the residue on the stone steps leading down to the docks. Corbin's voice was low, urgent. "No one with symptoms boards. If the fog follows them onto open water, the ferries will become coffins." Whitaker approached them, sweat beading on his brow. "Doctor, the people won't accept that. They'll riot." "Then we must hold the line," Corbin said. "If the sickness spreads to the boats, there will be nowhere left to run." Adelaide gripped her lantern. Its weak flame still flickered blue at the edges. "Dawn is weakening it, but not enough." Not nearly enough. The harbor wind shifted. Warm, sweet, wrong. People gasped as a faint shimmer drifted over the water's surface. For a moment it looked like heat haze, then it thickened, curving upward, forming wisps that curled like fingers. Whitaker swore softly. "It's coming back." A sailor on the nearest ferry shouted, "Cast off! Cast off now!" But his captain shook his head. "We leave only when—" "We're full!" "You'll drown us all!" the sailor cried. Corbin stepped forward, voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone listen!" The crowd turned. "The fog travels with breath," she said. "With water, with shadow, it is learning us. If we overfill the ferries, it will slip between us and overtake the entire vessel." Murmurs rippled through the docks. A man near the back shouted, "Then what are we to do? Stay here and wait for it to suffocate us?" Corbin's expression softened. "We must move with caution, with order, with the daylight we have." But daylight was fading, faster than it should. Clouds drifted overhead, dimming the sun. The sweetness thickened. Whitaker felt something cold coil around his ankle. He jerked back. A thin tendril of fog hovered there, warm to the touch, pulsing gently. "It's here!" someone screamed. The crowd surged forward. The docks shook beneath their weight. Children cried. A man leapt into the water in panic, only to thrash violently as the shimmering surface swallowed him with eerie speed. His screams cut off. The water stilled. The sweetness rose. Adelaide staggered. "Doctor, we must get these ferries out now, or the fog will take the docks too." Corbin nodded sharply. "Whitaker, load 50 per vessel, no more. Anyone else must wait for the next tide." "There may not be a next tide," he muttered, but he obeyed. The first ferry filled quickly, parents clutching children, elders carried by strangers, faces streaked with dirt and fear. When the ropes were severed, the vessel drifted away, oars slicing the shimmering surface. People held their breath until it cleared the first bank of fog. The second ferry took longer. Panic made hands clumsy, voices sharp. When it finally pushed off, the fog swirled toward it briefly, then retreated as if considering. The third ferry waited, half-loaded, trembling in its ropes. Corbin stood at the bow, face pale but resolute. "We leave now," she commanded. "Anyone left must find shelter until tomorrow. We cannot risk a fourth nightfall." A collective cry burst from the crowd, grief, terror, disbelief, but no one dared challenge her. Whitaker cut the final rope. The ferry lurched forward. Adelaide turned back toward the city. "Doctor, look." The fog had begun pouring down the streets again. Quiet, steady, patient. Corbin whispered, "Night is returning." The ferries drifted into open water, their lanterns flickering blue in the dimming light. Behind them, the harbor drowned in silence, as though the entire city had forgotten how to breathe. The tenements of Willow Glass Row had always possessed a voice. Timbers groaning beneath shifting weight, pipes clattering with winter's freeze, stairwells echoing with children's laughter or the clatter of hurried footsteps. They were buildings that lived loudly, congested with life pressed into two small rooms. But tonight, the tenements were silent, and in that silence, something else had begun to speak. It was just after sunset when Adelaide Marsh and Dr. Lydia Corbin reached Willow Glass Row. They had come searching for survivors. The air tasted metallic, heavy with the lingering sweetness that now haunted every corner of the city. The lamps burned low, their flames trembling in thin blue halos. Adelaide lifted her lantern. "Doctor, look." The entire block of buildings, once bursting with families, stood hollow. Windows gaped like missing teeth. Doors hung open, some swinging gently though no wind stirred. Laundry lines still held shirts and stockings that fluttered faintly as though brushed by invisible hands. Corbin approached the first doorway and froze. The faint pearlescent sheen coated the threshold. "It's been here," she murmured. Adelaide shivered. "It never leaves a place once it's entered. Unless it finishes what it came for." Corbin stepped inside. The tenement swallowed them instantly. The air grew warmer, thicker. Floorboards creaked beneath their weight, long, low groans that sounded almost resentful. Dust motes shimmered in the lantern light like drifting embers. "Listen," Corbin whispered. Adelaide did. The building was not silent. Not truly. Beneath the settling dust, beneath the distant crackle of lamps, beneath even their own breathing, there was another sound. A faint whisper, not of people, not of footsteps, but of breath, slow, measured, steady, exhaled by a throat that was not human. "It's coming from above," Adelaide said. They ascended the staircase. The steps creaked with each footfall, but halfway up something else answered, another creak, not caused by them. Corbin paused. "Someone's here." They climbed cautiously until they reached the third-floor landing. A thin trail of shimmering residue led beneath a door at the end of the corridor. Adelaide's lantern flickered. Corbin braced herself and pushed the door open. Inside, moonlight filtered through broken windows. The apartment was in disarray. Chairs overturned, blankets strewn across the floor, toys scattered as though abandoned mid-play. But this chaos was stale, days old. "Look," Adelaide whispered, pointing. At the center of the room lay a circle of residue, gleaming softly, coiling in delicate swirling patterns like frost on glass. It pulsed faintly, almost rhythmically. "It's breathing," Adelaide said. Corbin crouched closer. "No, it's listening." Suddenly, a voice, small, quivering. "Help!" The two women whirled around. A boy, no older than 8, stood, trembling behind a cupboard door, his oversized shirt hanging limp on his thin frame. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes glassy with fever. Adelaide rushed to him. "You're alive!" He nodded weakly, pointing toward the glowing residue. "It talked to us." Corbin knelt beside him. "What did it say?" He swallowed. "It told us to stay still. It told us not to breathe too loudly. It told us it would make us warm." Adelaide's blood froze. "Where are your parents?" He pointed to the circle. "We got warm. They got warmer." Corbin shut her eyes briefly. She did not need to look to know what remained within that residue. Adelaide forced a steady tone. "We need to leave. Now." But the boy shook his head violently. "No, we can't. It comes when the lamps dim." And then, as if summoned, the lantern flame sputtered. Shadows gathered at the corners of the room. The sweetness thickened, rolling in like invisible fog. The circle on the floor pulsed faster, lifting slightly as though preparing to rise. Adelaide grabbed the boy. "Move!" They bolted into the hall, but the tenement had changed. The air vibrated. The floorboards groaned like lungs straining for breath. The stairwell darkened as shadows pooled upward, twisting along the banister. Corbin shouted, "Keep the lantern high!" Adelaide raised it. The blue flame cast trembling light that pushed back the encroaching darkness, but only barely. Behind them, something whispered from inside the apartment. A soft, chilling murmur. "Breathe with us." The boy screamed. Adelaide tightened her grip, dragging him forward. Corbin reached the stairs first. "Go! Don't stop!" They sprinted downward. With each step, the building shook, doors slamming open, walls shuddering. Whispered breaths echoed in the stairwell like voices trapped in wood. When they burst through the front door, the sweetness hit them like a wave, but it was weaker outside, dissipating in the open air. Dawn approaching. Corbin collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Adelaide held the boy close, her lantern now dim and sputtering. The tenement behind them rattled once, shivered, and then fell eerily still. The boy whispered, "It wasn't done breathing." Corbin rose slowly, her face pale. "No," she said, "it has begun to use the buildings, the walls, the air inside our homes." Adelaide shuddered. "Doctor, the city isn't just infected." Corbin nodded grimly. "It is becoming a lung." City Hall had once been a monument to civic pride. Marble pillars polished to a gleam, grand portraits staring down from paneled walls, brass chandeliers casting warm pools of light across the council chamber. It was meant to symbolize order, stability, mastery over chaos. Tonight, it looked like a mausoleum. The chandeliers flickered in weak blue flames. The long table, usually crowded with papers, ledgers, and cups of tea, was bare except for a single oil lamp burning far too brightly. Dust coated the bookshelves as though weeks rather than hours had passed, and the councilmen who gathered here no longer resembled leaders, they resembled survivors. Dr. Lydia Corbin stood at the head of the table, her gloves smudged with residue and her face drawn from sleepless nights. Adelaide Marsh sat beside her, one hand clenched around her lantern as though it were a talisman. Across from them, Councilman Arlo Wexley, thin and sharp-eyed, cleared his throat. "Dr. Corbin, we appreciate your updates. But surely it isn't as dire as you claim." Corbin stared at him, unblinking. "Councilman, your colleague Horatio Pembroke died this morning." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Wexley swallowed. "The official report states heart failure." Adelaide leaned forward. His breath fogged in a warm room. His walls sweated residue, and his maid heard something breathing behind the plaster. "That is not heart failure, Councilman." Silence. Corbin placed a vial on the table, the same vial she had shown Pembroke before his collapse. The substance inside shimmered faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that did not match her movements. "This," she said, "was collected from the pump in St. Florian's Square, but the same substance now appears on walls, windows, bodies, and even the river." Another councilman, a young man whose hands shook visibly, leaned back. "What is it, Doctor?" "A presence," Corbin replied. "A living agent, not a bacterium, nor a vapor, nor anything we recognize. It uses disease as a language, a pathway, a disguise. It moves through breath, water, shadow, and warm spaces. And now," she pointed to the ceiling. The gas lamps fluttered weakly, their flames rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping creature. "It has begun to learn the shape of our light." Gasps erupted. Wexley pounded his fist on the table. "We cannot tell the public this. They'll riot." Corbin's voice sharpened. "They are dying, Councilman. Their silence will kill them faster than panic ever could." A woman at the far end of the table, Councilwoman Charlotte Stowe, leaned forward. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were iron. "Then we declare martial law," Stowe said. "Shut the streets, confine families indoors, limit movement." Adelaide shook her head. "Indoors is where it thrives. We've seen tenements breathe like lungs." Wexley snapped. "What do you propose then? The city cannot sleep under open sky?" Corbin hesitated, and then the lights dimmed. Every head turned upward. The chandeliers flickered once, twice, then glowed an unnatural shade of blue, tall, thin, wavering as though siphoned by an invisible mouth. Adelaide grabbed her lantern. It sputtered violently, the flame twisting sideways. Corbin whispered, "It's here." A low groan echoed through the chamber, not from any throat, but from the wood itself. The paneled walls shuddered, papers rustled through no breeze blew. The sweetness seeped into the room as though sliding under the door. The councilman rose, panic overtaking dignity. "Doctor," Stowe cried, "what is happening?" Corbin backed away from the walls. "It is listening." The chandelier flames stretched downward, reaching, casting skeletal shadows across the table. A voice whispered, not words, not human, a sound like breath brushing against a vast unseen lung. Wexley screamed, overturning his chair. "We must flee!" Corbin grabbed him by the arm. "No sudden movements. Hold your breath." The council chamber trembled as the sweetness thickened. The shadows along the walls pulsed, then slowly retreated, curling back toward the ceiling. And just as suddenly as it came, the presence thinned, dissipating like smoke. The lamp steadied, the sweetness faded. The room exhaled. Corbin released Wexley, who collapsed to the floor. Adelaide whispered, "It wanted us to know it could enter anywhere." "No," Corbin replied softly. "It wanted us to know we have run out of places to hide." Councilwoman Stowe stood shakily. "Doctor, what is left for us to do?" Corbin looked around the chamber. The place meant to safeguard the city, now violated as easily as any alleyway. "We prepare," she said. "We warn. We gather whoever still breathes." Her voice cracked. "And then we face it together." Outside, the fog thickened in the streets below, swirling, waiting, listening. Lanterns had become lifelines. Where once they were merely tools to cut through evening fog, now they were shields, tiny, trembling suns that kept the sweetness at bay. Every household that still clung to life kept at least one lantern burning through the night, its flame trimmed with almost ceremonial reverence. For if a lantern dimmed, the fog crept closer. And if a lantern died, no one who saw what followed survived long enough to describe it. Tonight, Adelaide Marsh carried the brightest lantern in the city, or so the survivors whispered. Its flame rose tall and blue-tipped, a strange, unwavering glow that seemed almost aware of itself. She had found it abandoned on the steps of the old observatory at dawn, burning with unnatural intensity, though its oil reservoir was nearly dry. "It wants to burn," Dr. Lydia Corbin had said when Adelaide brought it to the infirmary, as though something fights through the flame rather than against it. Now Adelaide walked alone through Greeley Avenue, her lantern illuminating the abandoned storefronts. The sweetness pressed in from all sides, warm as exhaled breath. The fog hung low, thick, pulsing faintly with each gust of night air. Her lantern hissed and grew brighter. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not yet." Behind her, Dr. Corbin and a dozen survivors followed carefully, each carrying lamps or candles. Children kept close to their parents. The elderly shuffled with fearful urgency. "We must reach the river," Corbin called softly. "Water flow weakens it. It spreads easier over still air than running current." A grim hope, but hope nonetheless. Adelaide lifted the lantern higher. Its light pushed the fog back like a hand pressing gently against flesh. But the fog resisted, curling, recoiling, then pressing forward again as though in irritation. A little girl clutched her mother's sleeve. "Miss Adelaide, the fog looks angry." Adelaide forced a smile. "Fog cannot be angry, my dear." But she wasn't certain anymore. She wasn't certain of anything. They reached the intersection at Kettering Street, a place often bustling with carriages and street vendors. Now it was a void. Chairs overturned, hats scattered. A single boot lay in the gutter as though the man wearing it had vanished mid-stride. Adelaide's lantern flared suddenly, so bright it hurt to look at. Dr. Corbin halted. "Adelaide, something's reacting." Before she could answer, the fog surged toward them in a single powerful wave, like a living tide. "Hold your lamps high!" Corbin shouted. Flames rose across the group, flickering weakly in the sweetness-saturated air. Only Adelaide's lantern held steady. The fog struck it and recoiled with a screeching hiss no human throat could have produced. Children screamed. Adults shielded them. The fog writhed like wounded flesh, pulling back, swirling violently at the edges of the street. Corbin grabbed Adelaide's arm. "It fears your lantern, or hates it, or recognizes it." The lantern blazed brighter, and then it cracked. A hairline fracture split the glass, glowing with white-blue fire. "Adelaide!" Corbin cried. "It's going to burst!" "No," Adelaide said, voice trembling but firm. "It's trying to warn us." The survivors backed away as the lantern's flame expanded beyond the chimney, a pillar of impossible brilliance. Shadows vaporized, sweetness thinned. The fog convulsed, pulling itself into a tight mass at the far end of the street. A sound rose from that mass, a low, resonant hum like the inhale of a monstrous lung. Corbin's eyes widened. "It's gathering itself. Adelaide, move." But Adelaide couldn't move. The lantern grew too bright to look at. A rush of heat poured from it, not burning but absolute, the heat of something cutting through layers of darkness. And then the lantern spoke. Not in words, not in any human form, but in a burst of expanding light that carried meaning like a shockwave through her chest. Adelaide gasped. "I saw something," she whispered. "A shape, a memory." Corbin shook her. "What did you see?" Adelaide stared toward the fog's heaving mass, trembling. "It didn't come to kill us," she said. "It came because something else drove it here, something older, something beneath the city." Before Corbin could respond, the lantern shattered. But instead of dying, its flame rose into the air, stretching upward like a beacon. The fog shrieked. The ground trembled. Adelaide collapsed. Corbin caught her, shouting commands to the survivors. The fog retreated, not defeated, but startled, wounded, wary. As the brightness faded, only the metal frame of the lantern remained, twisted, empty. Corbin looked down at Adelaide, whose breath came in rattled gasps. "It wasn't attacking," Adelaide whispered weakly. "It was speaking. We just never knew how to listen." Corbin felt her pulse race, because if the lantern had spoken, then the fog had been saying something all along, something they had mistaken as violence, something they were only now beginning to understand. And somewhere deep beneath the city, in places where lamps had never burned, something stirred in answer. The churches of the city had always been its lungs, breathing reassurance into fearful neighborhoods, exhaling comfort through hymns and candlelight. Their bells were the heartbeat of every morning and evening, tolling steady as the tide, calling worshippers, marking weddings, mourning the dead, reminding the living that time still moved forward no matter what darkness pressed against the streets. But tonight, the bells refused to ring. It began at St. Florian's Cathedral, the tallest church in the city, whose great bronze bell, cast a century earlier in a ceremony so elaborate it resembled coronation, hung silent in its tower. The ropes below it trembled gently in the wind, but the bell remained still, as though the metal itself no longer recognized the world it overlooked. Adelaide Marsh felt the absence at once. Standing beneath the cathedral arch with her cloak drawn tight, she looked up into the dim tower, expecting at any moment the deep, reassuring toll that marked nightfall. Instead, she heard only the rustle of warm, thick air shifting through the nave behind her. "It should have rung by now," whispered one of the survivors behind her, a schoolteacher clutching her sleeping daughter. Dr. Lydia Corbin approached, lantern in hand. Its flame flickered weakly. "Something is damping the vibrations. Sound itself is being stifled." Adelaide shivered. "It's the fog," Corbin nodded grimly. "It has learned to silence the warnings." Inside the cathedral, dozens of refugees huddled beneath pews and altars, families wrapped in coats and blankets, children curled against their mothers, elderly men gripping rosaries or whatever talismans their trembling hands could still hold. The air carried a faint sweetness even here, though the stone walls offered a thin barrier. A boy approached Adelaide, tugging her skirt. "Miss," he whispered, "the statues are crying." She frowned gently. "Statues do not cry, dear." But his eyes widened with terrified sincerity. Adelaide took the lantern and crossed the nave. The rows of candles flickered weakly, their flames bending sideways as though drawn toward the same unseen breath. She paused beneath a marble saint. A droplet ran down its cheek. Not water, not wax. Something thicker, pearlescent in the lantern light. Her stomach tightened. "Doctor, come see this." Corbin approached, brows furrowed. She touched the residue with a gloved finger and recoiled. "It's warm." Suddenly, a deep groan reverberated through the cathedral walls. The pews vibrated. The floor pulsed beneath their feet. The refugees gasped. Adelaide looked upward toward the bell tower. The fog had entered. They could see it through the slats. A shimmering mass curling around the massive bronze bell, warm tendrils coiling around its edges. With each pulse, the bell shuddered, but produced no sound. It was being smothered. Corbin whispered, "It doesn't want alarm, it wants silence." The fog thickened, spilling downward like liquid silk, creeping along the rafters, descending toward the nave. Adelaide thrust her lantern high, but the flames sputtered and shrank as though starved of oxygen. "It's suppressing the light," she gasped. Behind them, panic erupted. "The doors, bar the doors, keep the children close. God help us all." But even prayer sounded subdued, muffled by the warmth thickening the air. Then, a low, resonant hum filled the cathedral. Not fog, not wind, not any earthly vibration. The bell. It was vibrating, but not from the rope, not from human hands. The fog itself was forcing it to hum, a terrible mimicry of sound. The hum deepened until the stained glass windows trembled, candles guttered, people covered their ears. "It's communicating," Corbin whispered, horrified. "Not with us, with them." Adelaide stared. "Them?" Corbin backed away, eyes fixed on the tower. "There are others, more fog, not here yet, but near. It is calling to them." Then the hum stopped. Silence collapsed into the cathedral like an avalanche. For a moment no one breathed. Then a child's thin voice whispered, "Miss Adelaide, the fog is listening to us breathe." Adelaide turned. The fog had reached the floor. It curled around the pews, moving with unbearable patience, tasting the air as though sampling each human breath. Corbin grabbed Adelaide's arm. "We have to get everyone out, now. If we wait any longer, it will smother us like it smothered the bell." "But where do we go?" Adelaide cried. Corbin's voice trembled for the first time. "Anywhere with wind, anywhere open. The fog hates motion. The city center, there's open square beyond the markets." Adelaide raised her lantern, its flame barely a pale blue spark now. "Everyone, she called. "Stay together. Move quickly. Stay in the light." The refugees gathered what little they had and followed the lantern's faint glow. Behind them, the bell tower pulsed once more, not ringing, but breathing. As the cathedral doors shut behind them, the fog within swirled upward, wrapping around the silent bell like a lover embracing the object of its devotion. And in that moment, Adelaide understood. The city had lost its voice, and if the bells would not ring, the people must. The Grand Municipal Library had always been the one place in the city where silence felt sacred rather than ominous. Its high-arched ceilings softened every footstep, its oak shelves swallowed sound with gentle dignity, and its tall reading lamps glowed warmly upon polished tables worn smooth by generations of hands. Knowledge lived here in orderly rows, catalogued, contained, civilized, but nothing in the city remained civilized now. When Adelaide Marsh and Dr. Lydia Corbin pushed open the library's heavy double doors, they expected emptiness. Instead, they found warmth, too much warmth, rolling through the grand hall like slow breath. Dust motes glimmered in the lantern light, drifting lazily, as if suspended in syrup. Adelaide whispered, "Doctor, someone lit lamps." Corbin lifted her own failing lantern. "No, they're burning themselves." Indeed, the green-shaded desk lamps flickered wildly, flames drawing tall and thin, blue at the edges as though starving for air. The illumination cast trembling shadows across the stacks, giving the impression that the books themselves leaned forward to listen. A faint rustling rose from the shelves. Corbin stiffened. "Hear that?" Adelaide nodded slowly. "Pages. Turning." They stepped deeper into the reading hall. Rows of books stood silent, but the sound did not stop. Page after page after page turned somewhere beyond sight, steady, rhythmic, like the inhalation and exhalation of an enormous creature made of ink and paper. Adelaide gripped her lantern tighter. "Who's there?" No answer, only the whisper of paper. Shf, shf, shf. Corbin moved toward the central reference desk where an enormous ledger lay open. Its pages fluttered, not from breeze but from ripples in the warm air, moving outward in concentric waves. "It's reading," she murmured. Adelaide blinked. "Reading what?" "The city," Corbin whispered. "Its maps, its names, its districts. It is learning." Before Adelaide could respond, a loud thump echoed from the mezzanine above. They both looked up sharply. A man stood at the railing, thin, disheveled, his coat torn. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the lantern light like a frightened animal caught in the glow. "Please," he rasped. "Please, quiet. It hears every sound." Adelaide stepped forward. "Sir, come down. We can help you." But he shook his head violently. "No, no, you mustn't breathe too loudly." Corbin's voice softened. "What did you see?" He pointed toward the far end of the hall. It came from the archives, first as warmth, then as fog, then as knowing. Another page turned, then another, then dozens at once. Shh, 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 shh. Adelaide swallowed hard. "Doctor," Corbin lifted her lantern high. At the rear of the library, a thin, shimmering mist curled upward from the floorboards, warm, sweet, and pulsing. It wove between tables, glided across carpets, brushed the spines of books like fingers trailing across piano keys. Wherever it passed, books opened by themselves, pages fluttering wildly as though exhaling words. The man on the mezzanine began to sob. "It reads us. It reads everything." The fog shifted, responding to sound. It turned toward him. "Run!" Corbin shouted, but too late. The fog surged upward in a single deliberate coil. The man's scream cut short as the warmth engulfed him. His body convulsed violently once, twice, then went still, suspended as if pinned in air. Books flew open all around them, pages trembling in a terrible harmony. Adelaide grabbed Corbin's arm. "We have to get out." But Corbin stared in horror as lines of text lifted from the open ledger, ink rippling like water. Letters rose from the page, drifting skyward like soot caught in flame. They spun through the fog, which absorbed them greedily. "It's not just learning the city," Corbin whispered. "It's learning language." The fog pulsed, once, twice, then began forming shapes, letters, words, almost sentences, malformed, broken, but unmistakably imitative. Adelaide felt her throat tighten. "Doctor, it's trying to speak back." A final page snapped shut with the force of a slammed door. The fog contracted violently, then stretched toward them. Corbin seized Adelaide's hand. "Now, run!" They sprinted through the reading hall, lanterns flickering wildly. Behind them, the bookshelves groaned, coughing out dust as the fog pressed closer, too close, learning the rhythm of their footsteps, tasting the vibration of their breath. They burst through the library doors just as the fog reached the threshold. Warmth brushed Adelaide's ankle. She nearly fell. Corbin caught her and dragged her into the street. Behind them, the library doors slammed closed, not by wind, but by something inside. Adelaide collapsed against the stone steps, gasping. "Doctor, it knows words now." Corbin stared at the glowing windows, her face ashen. "And soon," she whispered, "it will know how to use them." The train yard at Briarhook Junction had always been a restless place. Steam sighing from engines, metal clanging against metal, porters shouting destinations through clouds of coal smoke. Even at night, the yard never slept. Locomotives wheezed like great iron beasts dreaming of flight. Lanterns bobbed between tracks, and telegraph wires hummed with ceaseless messages. But tonight, the train yard behaved as if it wanted to flee. Steam poured from idle engines unbidden, rising in frantic bursts as if the machines themselves were panicking. Wheels turned without conductors. Couplings snapped apart. Freight doors slammed shut. Carriages trembled on their tracks as though bracing for impact. Something had entered Briarhook Junction, and every locomotive felt it. Adelaide Marsh arrived with Dr. Lydia Corbin just after midnight, guided by a trembling telegraph operator who had delivered news of mechanical madness overtaking the trains. Their lanterns cast narrow cones of blue-tinged light along the gravel, revealing dozens of engines whistling discordantly, sparks snapping from their smokestacks. The sweetness rode the air in thick waves. Adelaide whispered, "Doctor, the fog was here before us." Corbin nodded grimly. "It may still be." They stepped between rows of towering locomotives, their iron sides hot from internal pressure they should not have possessed. Steam valves hissed sharply, almost like warning breaths. Suddenly, Train 11 surged forward a full foot. Adelaide leapt back with a cry. No one was in the driver's compartment. Corbin lifted her lantern toward the cabin window. The interior shimmered faintly, pearlescent residue glistening on the controls pooling along the wooden floorboards. "It's learning machines now," she murmured. A deep metallic groan resonated across the yard. Tracks vibrated beneath their feet. Carriages jolted as though something weighty moved inside them. Then came the first scream. A yard worker bolted from behind a coal wagon, face pale, eyes wild. "It's in the trains," he shouted. "It's driving them." Corbin caught him by the arm. "What did you see?" His breath came in ragged gasps. "The fog, climbing into the engines, crawling through the vents, warming the boilers, and then the wheels. God help us, the wheels started turning by themselves." As if to confirm his words, another engine jerked violently forward. Lanterns dangling from its sides swung wildly, casting dizzying shadows across the tracks. Adelaide turned toward a distant carriage as its doors slowly creaked open. Warm fog rolled out, thick, shimmering, deliberate. Corbin shouted, "Run!" But the fog did not chase them. It drifted toward the locomotive instead, curling around its wheels, its pistons, its iron feet, examining, testing, familiarizing itself with the machinery's anatomy. "It's choosing one," Corbin whispered. The chosen train shuddered. Steam erupted from its valves. Gears clanked into sudden motion. The headlamp flared bright blue, casting an eerie beam across the tracks. Then, with a howl like something living, the locomotive lurched forward. Workers screamed. Tools clattered. Adelaide pulled Corbin out of its path just as the iron beast thundered past them, sparks scattering beneath its wheels. "It's trying to leave the city," Adelaide gasped. Corbin stared as the engine barreled toward the switching yard. "No, it's trying to spread." The locomotive reached the first junction, and the fog poured into its funnel like breath feeding a lung. The beast roared, it accelerated, and every other locomotive on the line answered. One by one, engines burst into motion as though awakened by the same terrible idea. Wheels spun, pistons slammed, steam shrieked. A chorus of mechanical voices filled the train yard. Panic, urgency, hunger. Briarhook Junction had become a great iron heart, beating not with coal and fire, but with something warm, sweet, and alive. Corbin shouted, "We must disable the switches." Adelaide sprinted to the nearest lever, but the metal burned her glove. The sweetness sizzled along the iron rails. The fog gathered above the tracks, coiling like a conductor's hand poised to direct a terrible symphony. Trains rumbled, engines bellowed, the earth itself vibrated. A single thought pressed into Adelaide's mind, not her own, a terrible intuition rising from the fog's shifting form. It wants to leave the city. Corbin seized her arm. If it reaches other towns, if it spreads through every rail line, we will never contain it. A sound thundered behind them. One of the runaway engines had turned itself on the switching loop, aimed now toward the countryside tracks. Adelaide raised her lantern high. The flame fought to brighten, but dimmed under the oppressive sweetness. Corbin whispered, "We cannot stop the trains." Then, another voice answered, weak, strained, but unmistakable. Dr. Nathaniel Avery, fevered and pale, staggered into the yard, clutching the edges of a telegraph pole. "You cannot stop it," he rasped, "but you can still corner it." Corbin froze. "Avery, how did you—" He pointed toward the fog gathering above the departing engine. "You must force it back into the heart of the city," he wheezed, "before dawn breaks again, before it finishes learning." He collapsed. Adelaide caught him, heart pounding. Behind them, the main locomotive screamed like a horn blown by something ancient. The fog surged into it. The wheels spun. The tracks trembled. The first train broke free, charging toward the countryside like a predator loosed. And the city understood with terrible clarity. If the fog escaped tonight, the world would not merely lose a city. It would gain an empire of breath. The river had always been the city's quiet companion, broad, steady, patient. It carried ferry boats and fishermen, reflected the shimmer of gas lamps at dusk, and bore away the debris of daily life with a gentle, ceaseless current. Even in the darkest winters, when ice drifted in jagged plates along its surface, the river behaved like a reliable servant of nature. But tonight, the river was no servant. It was awake. Dr. Lydia Corbin, Adelaide Marsh, and a small group of survivors reached the riverbank just as the sky bruised into deep violet. They had fled from Briarhook Junction after the fog commandeered the locomotives, their breath still ragged with fear and coal dust. The sweetness clung to them like fever, settling in their clothes, their hair, their lungs. When they reached the water's edge, Adelaide froze. The river glowed, not brightly, not like lantern fire or moonlight, but with a faint undulating sheen beneath its surface. It shifted in slow ripples, as though a warm, shimmering skin stretched across the current. Corbin exhaled sharply. "It's using the water again." A fisherman's abandoned rowboat knocked silently against the rocks. A lantern lay inside, long extinguished, its glass fogged from the inside. The young telegraph boy who had accompanied them whispered, "Miss, the water's breathing." Adelaide leaned forward, horrified. He was right. The river inhaled, the surface dipped inward, as though pulled toward a vast lung beneath. Then it exhaled, rising in a swell that splashed against the stones, warm droplets scattering across their boots. Corbin pulled Adelaide back. "No one goes near it, not a step closer." Behind them, the city's distant lamps flickered blue one by one as the fog moved through the streets. The survivors clustered together on the embankment, their shadows trembling along the stones. "We need to cross," Adelaide said. "If the trains are gone and the ferries are scarce, the river is the only path left out of the city." Corbin shook her head. "We'd be throwing ourselves into its mouth. Look." The river's surface churned, the shimmering sheen thickening into slow-moving coils. Shapes formed beneath the water, rolling and dissolving, as though the fog was teaching the river how to mimic life. The telegraph boy gasped. "It knows we're here." Ripples moved toward them, deliberate, converging, tightening like a noose of water and warmth. One of the survivors, a carpenter with shaking hands, stumbled backward. "We're trapped. It will come up the bank. It will take us." Corbin steadied him. "Not if we keep moving. Stay behind the lanterns." But Adelaide's lantern, still cracked from the explosion of brilliance earlier, flickered erratically. Its glow dimmed and brightened like a heartbeat losing focus. "Doctor," she whispered, "it's failing." Corbin took the lantern gently from her hands. The flame is fighting. But it's nearly spent. The river surged upward, a tall, silent swell rising like a creature rearing its head. It froze at full height, watching them. Then, slowly, a hand-shaped ripple formed along its crest, a water-formed palm, 5 wavering fingers, reaching. Adelaide's breath hitched. It's learning us. It's learning our shape. Without warning, the river lunged. The swell crashed forward, not as liquid but as something with intention. Warm water struck the embankment violently, knocking 3 survivors off their feet. Adelaide screamed and rushed toward them, pulling a young mother to safety. Corbin grabbed the telegraph boy moments before another tendril of river water curled around his leg like a tightening coil. The carpenter was not so lucky. His scream echoed across the water as the river surged around him, dragging him toward its center. The others grabbed his arms, pulling, straining, shouting his name. The water pulsed. Warmth flared. The sweetness filled their lungs and the river pulled harder. Corbin shouted, "Let go! If you don't, it will take you all!" But Adelaide held on, knuckles white, teeth clenched, refusing to abandon him. The river hissed, a sound like steam escaping iron lungs. Suddenly, a violent jet of water burst upward from the river's heart, striking Adelaide's lantern. The last of its flames sputtered, flickered, strained, then flared bright gold one final time. The river recoiled. The carpenter collapsed to the stones, trembling violently, free, but barely conscious. Adelaide cradled the dying lantern. "The light still frightens it, even now," Corbin nodded, breathing hard. "But not enough to stop it. Not anymore." The river inhaled again, preparing for another strike. But the sky shifted. Dawn approaching, faint, pale, fragile. A thin band of sunlight crested the rooftops, spilling onto the water's surface. For a moment, the sheen evaporated. The river sighed, a deep, resentful exhale, and retreated, settling back into its natural flow. Corbin whispered, "Daylight weakens it, but daylight is running out." Adelaide swallowed hard. "Where do we go now?" Corbin looked toward the city center, where fog gathered like storm clouds preparing to descend. "To the heart," she said, "to where it began. If we don't understand its origin—" Her voice faltered. The river exhaled faint warmth, as though knowing they planned to leave it behind. "Then we cannot end it." The sun rose another inch, the river stilled, but the city behind them began to breathe faster. The heart of the city, the financial district, the chambers of governance, the square where merchants shouted their prices and clerks tallied accounts, had once pulsed with vitality. Cobblestones gleamed beneath horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickered with warmth, illuminating the proud facades of townhouses and offices. Life, however precarious, always persisted. Tonight, that heart beat differently. Dr. Lydia Corbin, Nurse Adelaide Marsh, and the remaining survivors reached the square just as the fog had returned with renewed determination. It moved deliberately, filling streets with a thick sweetness, curling around lampposts, pooling in corners, slipping beneath doors. It pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city itself. Adelaide shivered. "It knows this is the center. It knows everything." Corbin nodded grimly. "It's learning the city's structure, its pulse, its weaknesses. The heart, this square, is the most efficient place to control the rest." Merchants huddled inside their shuttered shops. Clerks leaned over desks in offices with windows tightly closed, trying to continue business, oblivious or desperate. Families hid behind velvet curtains, holding children close, praying that the warmth in the air was only a hallucination. But it was not. The sweetness thickened around the square. It rose from the gutters, from the cobblestones, from the broken water fountains at the center. The air shimmered faintly, folding itself around street corners like fingers testing the stones. Every exhalation, every breath taken by the living was instantly measured, catalogued, and returned in warmth, mocking and dangerous. A scream cut across the square, a lone clerk who had left a window slightly ajar. Her hands clutched her face as the fog rose through the frame, brushing against her skin with chilling intimacy. She collapsed. Her breath fogged the warm air, and the sweetness clung to her lips like a whisper. Adelaide grabbed Corbin's arm. "We can't let it reach the city hall." Corbin scanned the square. Gas lamps burned faintly, blue-tipped, struggling against the advancing fog. Their light flickered across the faces of terrified survivors. The lamps slow it. Only enough to survive a few minutes. We must act. A group of city clerks emerged from a building, paper in hand, intending to escape across the square. They froze when the fog rolled toward them like a living wall. The sweetness wrapped around their feet. One clerk sank to his knees, gasping, fingers clawing at the ground as if trying to tear free from invisible chains. Corbin shouted, "Get inside! Close every door! Keep the lamps burning!" But some did not obey. The fog advanced. It pressed upward against buildings, curling over roofs, pooling along ledges. Warm mist drifted down into alleys and open courtyards, moving with patience and precision. Where it passed, the faint pearlescent sheen settled on walls, cobblestones, and street furniture. Windows fogged from the inside. Adelaide's lantern sputtered in response, its flame flickering violently as though feeding on her fear. She held it high. The warm light cut a narrow path through the sweetness. The fog recoiled slightly, hissing softly, but its mass was patient, unwavering. A bell tolled in the distance from a church just outside the square, but the sound seemed muffled, almost swallowed. Its vibration shook the cobblestones faintly, yet the fog absorbed it as easily as it had absorbed the breath of humans, of horses, of the dying. Corbin's eyes widened. It's learning how to ignore sound. It's absorbing every warning the city tries to send. Adelaide's heart pounded. Then what? What can we do? Corbin swallowed hard. We have to confront it at the center. We have to reach the fountain. The fountain, the heart of the square, the origin of circulating water, glistened faintly under the blue glow of gas lamps. Warm droplets shimmered atop the marble, tracing veins across its surface. The fog pulsed around it, thickening, curving toward the edges of the square like a predator encircling prey. Adelaide raised the lantern higher. Its glow flared brightly. The fog recoiled, writhing against the light, but it did not retreat. It was testing, learning, preparing. Corbin whispered, voice tight, "The city's heart is under siege, and tonight, if we fail, the entire city will become its lungs." Adelaide swallowed hard, breath fogging in the warm, cloying air. A faint vibration hummed beneath the cobblestones, deep, rhythmic, synchronized with the square itself. The city's heart was alive. And it was listening. Dawn came slowly that morning, pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself feared what it would reveal. Its light spilled reluctantly across the city, brushing the cobblestones with gold that felt more like ash. Gas lamps, now flickering weakly, cast their last blue-tinged flames before the horizon claimed them entirely. Silence pressed against the streets, heavy and almost unbearable. A silence not of peace, but of exhaustion, of defeat. Dr. Lydia Corbin and Nurse Adelaide Marsh stood atop the steps of St. Florian Square, surveying the city's aftermath. Their eyes traced streets once alive with merchants, children, and carts. Now, every thoroughfare seemed flattened beneath a blanket of sweet pearlescent haze. Windows hung open or shattered, doors swung on broken hinges, and the occasional groan of a collapsing structure echoed faintly in the distance. The fog had receded somewhat, but not completely. It lingered like a predator still satisfied enough to watch, yet hungry enough to wait. Adelaide's hand trembled as she gripped her lantern. Though the flame was steady, it offered little comfort, casting weak, wavering shadows across their path. "Doctor," she whispered, "the city, it's not breathing again." "Not really." Corbin nodded, her expression tight and weary. "It never will, Adelaide. Not as it was. Whatever this presence has become, it has learned the rhythms of every street, every building, every human heartbeat it touched." They descended into the square, where the central fountain, the origin of circulating water that had carried the sickness across districts, still shimmered faintly under the weak dawn light. Its marble surface was flecked with the same warm, iridescent residue that had haunted the tenements, the orphan trains, and the hospital wards. Small eddies of pearlescent mist swirled across its edges, rising and falling with a rhythm as if the fountain itself had inhaled and exhaled. A distant clatter drew their attention. Survivors, those who had somehow endured the night, began to emerge from hidden corners and collapsed structures. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, some bearing feverish traces of the illnesses that had swept through the city. others trembling from exposure to the fog's strange warmth. Each inhaled carefully, as though fear alone could keep them alive. Corbin approached the first survivor, a young mother carrying a child in her arms. The child's skin shimmered faintly with the lingering residue. "It's still here," the mother whispered. "Even now I can feel it. Watching us." Adelaide swallowed. "We can't let them breathe too deeply," she said softly. "Keep the lanterns high." They moved through the square slowly, urging the survivors to follow, guiding them toward open air where the early sunlight thinned the fog slightly. Each step revealed more devastation. Buildings that had once symbolized stability lay partially collapsed. A bakery's stone oven had split, spilling bricks into the street. Children's toys, dolls, wooden blocks, ragged balls, sat abandoned, their surfaces glittering faintly with the pearlescent sheen. Corbin paused beside the central fountain, studying the water. "It used the city's lifeblood to learn," she murmured. "Water, air, the people themselves. It took all that was alive and made it an extension of itself." Adelaide shivered, drawing her cloak tighter. "Then, what now? The city will never recover." "No," Corbin admitted, "not fully, not as it was. But perhaps we can endure. Those who survived the night are proof. They are the memory of what was. They carry the lesson of vigilance." They reached the edge of the square, where survivors gathered for a moment's rest. Light fell fully upon them now, thin but honest. The fog clung to the city's edges, wispy and retreating, but still present, curling around buildings and under arches. It did not roar, it did not attack, it simply waited. Adelaide knelt, pressing a hand to the stone. "It's patient," Corbin nodded. "It always was, and the city, well, we were naive to think that distance, walls, wealth, or light could protect us from the air we all share." A gust of wind stirred, carrying the faint, sweet scent that had haunted the nights. It rose from the streets, from the rubble, from the river, weaving through survivors' hair and clothing. They inhaled cautiously, lungs trembling. The sweetness lingered, gentle yet insistent, a reminder that the city, though battered, had survived the night. But it would never again be the same. Adelaide exhaled slowly. "The dawn hasn't healed us." Corbin placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, but it has reminded us that we endure, that life persists, that vigilance must continue." The survivors stirred, moving toward open fields and sunlit streets beyond the square. The fog retreated slightly in response to the morning light, but its presence lingered like a shadow, tethered to every building, every street, every breath. The city's heart still beat, but differently now, slowly, carefully, tentatively. And somewhere deep within its veins, the memory of the sweetness, the sheen, the fog, the illnesses, all of it, remained alive. Adelaide raised her lantern, letting its light fall across the group. "We move forward," she said softly, "together." And the dawn, pale, hesitant, unhealing, spread across a city that had survived, changed forever, but still breathing.